Hey everyone, Emerson Green here. I was just going for a walk in the woods, as you can see behind me, and I thought to myself, I should re-upload that episode that I recorded 5 years ago about socialism with Micah Edvenson, who at the time was a lowly undergraduate, but soon he'll be Dr. Micah Edvenson. It's funny to think about because 5 years ago I was just a relatively unknown podcaster with a modest platform who thought he was a lot smarter than he probably actually was, but now so we don't need to reflect on that too much. Anyway, I'm re-uploading this episode about socialism because, well, not to sound condescending, but when I was a child, I thought as a child. But it's time to grow up. Things have changed, my beliefs have changed, and I'm here today to tell you that I am much, much more confident in nearly everything I said in that podcast. Yeah, I was completely right, and so was Micah, so I thought I'd re-upload it. I guess one thing I should mention is that it's kind of an artifact of the time because, again, it was recorded 5 years ago. This is before the 2020 election, and I think it's right at the start of coronavirus. Okay, so with that, I hope you enjoy it. Today I'll be speaking with Micah Edvenson about socialism. Throughout we reference many books, articles, and videos. These can all be found in the show notes in the order they're mentioned. And you can get access to the extended edition of this episode at patreon.com/waldenpod and early releases. So without further ado, here's my conversation with Micah Edvenson. I have with me the host of the Crusade Against Ignorance YouTube channel, philosopher, and loyal friend to the glorious cause of the workers' movement, Comrade Micah Edvenson. Micah, how are you doing?
I'm doing pretty good, man. Thanks for having me on. I love that introduction, comrade.
So, for those who might not be familiar with you, I'll just say that your channel comes highly recommended for me. You have really great videos on atheism and abortion and all sorts of philosophical subjects, including the one we're discussing today, socialism. And I think socialism is a subject that philosophers shouldn't shy away from. You know, it is a philosophical issue, not just an issue for economists or, people who comment on the news. So you want to persuade others to become socialists. And for anyone listening, if it seems unlikely that socialism will ever be a live option for you, I could see this episode at least helping you articulate why more effectively. So at the very least, you won't walk around saying the equivalent of why are there still monkeys? This has become, or it's increasingly a hobby horse of mine. You can't really level a meaningful critique of a position if you don't understand the position to begin with. And part of that is immersing yourself in the literature or podcast videos or whatever of people who actually agree with that position. So we won't be able to get to everything, but we can tackle some of it. So how did you become a socialist?
All right, good question. Well, I want to say first, thanks for having me on. Appreciate the kind words in the introduction. I'm a fan of your work as well, so glad to see that my stuff is sort of getting out there. And yeah, I've done some conversations about socialism over on my channel as well. But as you say there, I think it is very important. You're definitely right that this is something that philosophers, particularly political philosophers, but I think, philosophers in general should take interest in all relevant topics to society. So, but particularly political philosophers, it's definitely more than an economic issue, and we'll get into why. But you're definitely right that understanding any issue is step one in terms of engaging it critically. And actually, this kind of bleeds well into your first question there, because properly understanding anything is the first step towards believing it yourself. And that's kind of how it was for me, actually. I mean, we've talked a little bit before. I came from a background as, the first time I ever really started to get into political philosophy was sort of a very kind of shallow engagement with it. But I nonetheless, and I was a libertarian for, I don't know, probably about a year or two, or a right-wing libertarian, I should say, kind of in the vein of maybe classical liberalism or Robert Nozick, what we'd maybe call minarchism, just kind of like a very limited government, pro-capitalist. I was even an anarchist capitalist, which is not actually a thing. I was just called stateless capitalist because, anarchism is anti-capitalist, actually. So that's a common mistake people make. And I did too. So I came from a libertarian background for a couple years. And actually, the first step towards me becoming a socialist was just actually understanding what socialism was, because I kind of, as a libertarian, had this misconception that a lot of people do about it, kind of the, why are there still monkeys sort of objection. Like, look at Venezuela or Cuba or the USSR or the Nazis or whatever, all these like really just kind of very basic mistakes people make in reasoning about this topic. So simply understanding what it was and being willing to actually kind of look into it and kind of looking into what it was. Of course, but if I had to pick a landmark moment in terms of when I started to kind of shift to become a leftist, I always tell people that the person, and particularly the work who made me leftist, the person was Noam Chomsky. And I've talked to a couple friends who have had similar experiences. We kind of have now kind of dubbed him the father of the modern left, because I've got a couple friends who are also kind of democratic socialists like me now, who attribute their becoming leftists, or at least their journey, their introductory path towards leftism, starting with Noam Chomsky. And it was his book. He has a pretty short little book actually called On Anarchism that I read because I was interested. I'd been interested in the anarchist thought for a while, but I was always, when I first got into it, and for a while, I was always more sympathetic to like the individualist side of the tradition. And so kind of the closer to what we'd call capitalist understandings of stateless political philosophy. And so I was interested just in anarchism itself as a political philosophy, which led me to want to read this book by Chomsky, because he's a big figure in terms of recent anarchist philosophy. So I was like, oh, I want to read this book. So I got it. It's like $12 on Amazon. I'd highly recommend it. It's pretty short. I think I read most of it in a day. And he talks about George Orwell's Homage to Catalonia, which was big. And then he talks about the difference between like the right-wing libertarians and then the libertarian socialist tradition that he's a part of. And he lays out the difference and kind of demarcates what socialism is and how socialists understand power structures. Now, Chomsky's work is a lot on power structures themselves and how power concentrates and why we should care about that and how to affect it. And so he kind of it was a short book, and it wasn't very complex political philosophy or anything, but just it was very clearly stated and very clearly laid out, his vision of how socialists view power and why they really do value freedom, and how to properly understand and have freedom. You can kind of be against these capitalist power structures. And we can talk a little bit more about what all that means, but it wasn't super complicated. It was just the act of being willing to sit down and kind of read through and actually think through. And I was like, yeah, like I'm kind of been so pro freedom this whole time. And this makes a lot of sense. Like, what he's saying here about like how power structures can be similar across whether it's private, public, and why we care about that. And so his sort of just simply stated vision for how libertarian socialists understand power and freedom was very appealing to me. And that kind of set me down the path. And since then, I've read a lot more Chomsky and a lot more from other socialists. But that was sort of my probably introductory point into where I was like, it was very like a week or less after I read that book, I was going around telling people like, yeah, I'm technically a leftist now because I'm sort of anti-capitalist, at least in a minimal sense. So I wasn't super left-wing at that point. I was probably what we'd call like a mutualist, which is a tradition that comes out of Pierre Joseph Proudhon. And I think like a modern advocate would be like Kevin Carson. That was kind of my introductory baptism into leftism, but I wasn't super far left-wing. That was just sort of how I got into it initially. So hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah, no, it's crazy because a lot of that could have come out of my own mouth. Like I started out as a kind of right-wing libertarian in high school. It was kind of like a juvenile libertarianism where it was just like, well, I mean, not totally. I mean, it was just like drugs should be legal and war is bad, and the government.
Yeah, they got some things right.
Yeah,
right,
yeah, for sure. And then like the thing that changed me mostly was that I went to work. Like I didn't go to college right away. I just like I started working jobs, and that'll radicalize you pretty quickly.
Yeah, for sure.
And by the way, not because I don't want to work. I mean, that's a common misconception that socialists are sort of anti-work. I would also include myself, by the way, in that sort of libertarian strain of thought, where my starting point kind of has always been individual freedom and like how to maximize freedom and, minimize suffering as well. But if you happen to live like I do in 21st century America, then the main threat to individual freedom these days is not really the state, it's more the private sector. Like that's the main institution that is a threat to individual liberty in our day and age. Like I can understand being more anti-state when there was a hereditary monarchy. But, and I guess that kind of brings us to another question I wanted to ask you, which is, why is socialism gaining popularity, especially among the young, in your opinion?
Ooh, that's a good question. Well, I think it's partially kind of similar to our stories. I mean, I don't think, and not to be, sound like elitist. I don't mean that in this way. I'm just saying, like, I don't think most people are reading Noam Chomsky and that's how they're becoming socialists. Like I had a weird kind of story because I mean my first work experience I was kind of similar, but I worked for like a family business, people that I'd known for a long time. So and even though there were days where I was like, man, I'm doing a lot of work and they're getting a lot of money, what's going on here? Those kind of just like really the first touches of Marxist leanings. But I think for a lot of people, it's similar experiences to yours, where you go out into the world and you just, and even if you don't, not even necessarily if you go right into work, but even if you go right into college and student loan debt and like the way those kind of systems function at universities, I think a lot of it has to do with, for one thing, younger generations being more progressive, but that's not necessarily tied to socialism. I think it's because a lot of people are being radicalized. I mean, people are paying attention. We live in an information age, so now you can get a news update on your phone that says, like I remember when Bernie Sanders was doing his presidential run this year, there were fact checks that came up. I have like a fact checker app, and one of the things that came up was like Bernie Sanders, his claim is that 3 dudes own 50% of the wealth in America. And I was like, yeah, this is true. And so the fact that you have this access of wealth, kind of this great access to information, and you can just get a news update that's like, hey, there's 3 guys that own half the capital in this country. I think it is radicalizing people because they're going to work, they're going to school, and they're like, I'm in debt, and I'm in debt, I'm working, and I'm trying to like get by and scrape through an existence here. And there are people that have massive amounts of wealth that could end student loan debt, end poverty and hunger in places of the world if they just, a snap of their fingers, if they decided to, when they just aren't deciding to. They're just actively choosing not to. And there's some billionaires that do kind of philanthropic work, like Bill Gates, and to the extent that's good in terms of like effective altruism. But there is a good article by Rob Larson, an economist, on why philanthropic giving by these billionaires is kind of a racket. But that's a side point. I mean, I think it's hard to pinpoint that. The problem with this question is it's hard to pinpoint one thing, right? Because there's just so much wrong with the world that I think we're kind of in this existential moment where we're sort of looking around and you just feel, I think there is an existential element of freedom to it. Like we're talking about how both value freedom. And Martin Hagland, in his recent book called This Life, Secular Faith and Spiritual Freedom, he talks about kind of the spiritual freedom element to draw towards socialism, and how there is this almost existential feeling of looking around the world and like crushing debt, terrible working conditions, a lot of jobs that are just kind of mechanical and not fulfilling at all, that you just have to get into this kind of consumerist cog in the machine to just scrape by an existence. And I think there is just this kind of profound feeling of unfreedom. And as people like Zizek have said, we don't necessarily always have the language to express our unfreedom. But I think maybe even it's partially subconscious, but I think people are realizing that the power structures in place, and particularly the economic power structures, are a big part of what's contributing to this, the fact that we aren't really free to live our lives as we see fit. And people do often want to talk about how, the government infringes on your freedom, and anything that goes on in the market is just, that's voluntary choice, that's free. And that's just a horrible farce. I mean, Elizabeth Anderson is a classic egalitarian philosopher. She has a book called Private Government, and it's entirely about this topic, about how private, like CEOs and bosses, like basically rule our lives, and we don't really talk about it or recognize it as tyranny because we just sort of have this ingrained ideology that anything that goes on in the market is free. We have free markets, so it's hard to pinpoint.
That is a pet peeve of mine. That drives me insane, of how you can get away with anything in this country if you just do it in the name of like a private institution. Like all you have to do is change the noun from government to your boss or corporation or something, and people will just let anything happen. And I on this question of like, why is socialism gaining popularity? I was talking to my grandfather-in-law recently, and he was telling me about his pension and his like medical benefits. He worked at IBM for a long time and retired like maybe 10 years ago. And like my jaw was just on the floor as he was telling me about his benefits and like just the deal that he got. And he was kind of lamenting the fact that, younger kids are like becoming more interested in socialism. And I mentioned to him, I was like, look, the deal that you got that you were just telling me about a few minutes ago, that doesn't exist anymore in this country. Like nobody is getting that deal that you got. Like that just is not
even close.
Not even close. And, if whether you have a college degree or not, there are tons of people who can't afford to buy a car or a home. They can't afford to get married, much less have children. Why would you be surprised when some of them start questioning capitalism and, moving towards socialism when we're faced with this type of systemic failure?
I think also the kind of, that's definitely true. And that was one thing I said. There are some talking points that aren't even necessarily socialist, but get people into it. Like a lot of stuff Bernie Sanders says about like, hey, you should have healthcare. And like this, a lot of like the common sense stuff he points out, that like every industrialized country in the world has these things and we don't. And the only reason we don't is because we just choose not to. Like the reason people are dying without healthcare is because we've chosen not to put a Medicare for all system in place, even though every industrialized country in the world has it. So there's some of that common sense stuff. But I think you're definitely right that like there's also, I mean, we've had, it's kind of just the American economic system is sort of just a series of crashes and bubbles and bursting. Like 2008 was a huge crash, and then we're kind of having one now a little bit with the coronavirus, which is of course an extenuating circumstance. But people are questioning a system where everything can collapse at any moment, and people that are worked hard their whole lives can just lose everything in like a month because of the way some stocks go. Like that, I think people are realizing that like whatever we're doing, because people always talk about, well, socialism doesn't work, which for A isn't true, but B, I mean, you think capitalism does? Like, look at the world we're living in. Look at like how it deals with a crisis, like coronavirus. So that's, I think, part of the reason why is people are becoming less enamored with this anti-socialist rhetoric, and they're more realizing like, okay, well, whatever we're doing now isn't working. So let's look at alternative systems. And when you look at alternative systems, there aren't really any completely socialist countries in the world. The closest is like Denmark. They have like 60% national ownership of like means of production.
Wait. So where are the gulags? I mean, how have they not descended into tyranny and just mass death and starvation? I don't understand.
Well, that's the part I conveniently left out. That's So yeah, I think a lot of it is commonsensical and also just realizing the system failing, and you look at other things. And I mean, also maybe there is an element to it. I mean, some of this is speculative on my part, but I think there may be an element to it of like America was just so engaged in this anti-communist propaganda and anything any left-wing stuff they've disparaged, and there's been so much anti-left-wing propaganda for so long, especially ever since like the Cold War, like Red Scare, all that I think now we're finally we have a generation that's being raised without that as much propaganda. For sure, there's still a ton of anti-left-wing propaganda, but it's not quite as intense, and it doesn't take hold as easily. So you don't have generations that are as easily brainwashed by, the talking points like, oh, well, if you want free healthcare, you're going to end up in a working camp or something. Like, people are, that rhetoric is becoming less popular, partially because maybe people just didn't grow up with it. So, I mean, that's speculative, but a lot of this is, I mean, I feel like there's my story of how I became a socialist and has something to do with existential feelings. But I think that's the answer. The simple answer to the question is there are a lot of answers. Like there are a lot of reasons why you'd look at the system and be like, man, everything sucks. Let's try something different.
I think you hit on something that's so important. The question of choices that are made. Like the way things are is not simply a product of nature. And like the way things are in the US, it's not just all a product of natural law. Like you can give all the money to a handful of people and everyone else has to go into debt and everyone else is in trouble, but that's a choice. It's not a law of nature. A different distribution of wealth would also be a choice.
But yeah, I think that's part of the point why Bernie Sanders' rhetoric is so effective, is just being like, hey, things are only this way because we've made them this way. We have a government. We can change these things if you vote in the right people. And of course, I mean, voting is obviously only so effective in electoral politics in a two-party system, but still, that is like an important part of this message is like, hey, things don't have to be this way. Things don't have to be this bad. The systems are in place because we put them in place. And a lot of it goes back to the founding of the country, but we fixed things since then. We can fix things now. So I think that is a big part of it, is like, things are the way they are because people make choices and political systems are structured a certain way. And that's why pointing to other countries is so effective, of being like, hey, not only do we not have to live like this, there are actually alternatives that are better, and other people are making it work a lot better. And, you poll other countries, people are on average a lot happier, a lot safer. And so that's part of why that rhetoric, that simple rhetoric of like, hey, look at what these other places are doing. We don't have to live like this, so effective. Because yeah, as you said, it's like, we're a product, the political systems we have in place are a product of how we've chosen to distribute resources and power. And we can change that. We're the governing body. And so ideally we should be able to change this. So that is definitely important in terms of also you have to also understand how you can even affect change. And it's important to look at historically political movements that have been able to affect change. And so that's all very crucial to understanding all of this.
I suppose we should define the thing we're talking about at some point. So
yeah, that'd be great. That'd be great if we did this whole thing in for an hour. Then somebody at the end was like, "Yeah, but what about Venezuela?" And I was like, "Shit, I forgot to cover that one." Yeah.
Okay, so what do we mean by socialism, and what do we not mean?
Good. Okay, that's good. So yeah, we'll start off with defining capitalism and socialism. I mean, it's helpful to define it in contrast to capitalism. We can talk about the in-betweens. As far as if anybody wants recommended resources on this, there are a lot of good ones. The best one to start, though, is there's a 1,000-word philosophy website, has an article by Thomas Metcalfe, who's a philosopher. It's just called Defining Capitalism and Socialism. It's very simple. And he has a follow-up piece he gives arguments for either one they're pretty good arguments for both sides, and they're pretty solid. So it's well written and it's simple. But basically, so a lot of people have misconceptions about what socialism means, because we've talked about, a lot of people have this very, very infantile objection to it, which is just, it's all it is central planning or government control, and we don't want totalitarianism, so we can't have socialism. And the funny thing you get from that is, so for example, like George Orwell's book Animal Farm, a lot of people read that and they're like, see, he was critiquing Stalin, it's anti-socialist, of course. And Jordan Peterson even read something from Orwell and was like, this is what gave me my revelation about why socialism is bad. Of course, the funny thing is George Orwell was, in fact, an outspoken socialist, and even in the writing Peterson cited there, he says as much. And Animal Farm has definitely some distinctly pro-socialist elements.
Read Homage to Catalonia or Down and Out in Paris and London if you're in any doubt about this, to anyone listening.
Yes, Homage to Catalonia is definitely a great one to start with. And Animal Farm is great. It's pro-socialist and anti-totalitarian, so it's awesome.
Yeah.
You just have to read it correctly. But as far as defining socialism, it shouldn't be defined as government control. So when we're talking about socialism and capitalism, in a sense, we're talking about economics. We're also talking about how power and wealth are distributed. So it's at the fundamental level, the definitions are about how private, or sometimes called capital goods, are owned and controlled. That's important too, because there's the ownership side of it, but there is also the control side to it. Current Affairs has a good piece called Ownership and Control by Nathan Robinson and Rob Larson, where they talk about how socialists understand this differently from capitalists. But the basic definition is just this. Socialism is, and this is Metcalfe's definition, is a system in which most or all capital goods are socially owned and controlled, shared in a society and controlled by that society, possibly by a government. So you can kind of use capital goods interchangeably with private property. And private property in this sense means of like major means of production. So things like factories or machineries, fields, plantations, anything like that. Anything that has like the capacity to en masse like produce material goods or wealth. So capital goods and private, because a lot of people talk about private property and they equivocate on what that means. If socialists are fine with you owning like your house and your toothbrush, that's obviously okay.
Right. Petty personal property versus private property.
Yeah, so the personal versus private property distinction. Sometimes it's better just to call it capital goods, like ownership of capital, the things that are used to produce wealth or produce labor or to subjugate labor, which then produces wealth in turn. Anything like that. So the defining feature of socialism is that most or all capital goods are socially owned and socially controlled, which means they're shared by people in a society, controlled by that society. So this can be a government, but it's not always a government. So, I mean, the history of socialist philosophy and socialist thought, at least half of it, and maybe even the majority of the tradition, has been an anarchist tradition, going back all the way to like Kropotkin. A lot of socialist throughout history have been anarchists. They've been against the existence of a state. So these objections that, socialism entails some sort of central planning. I mean, most of your socialists, at least the early ones, a lot of them were very, very anti-central planning of any sort. And a lot of them still are, unless, you're kind of just like an old school like communist or a certain kind of communism. There's all sorts of different kinds of communism, but that's not what we're talking about. So, of course, it's helpful to distinguish socialism from capitalism, which capitalism is a system in which most or all the capital goods are privately owned and privately controlled. So you can have, one or two people that own, mass shares or stocks, or they own a factory, and they don't have to directly work in it. They can sort of just own it and control what goes on in it from a distance. And all the labor can be kind of dealt out to or meted out to, lower managers and workers. And so very rarely in capitalist systems do you have the people that own the capital goods actually working with them or on them. You don't have like the owner of a Toyota factory working on a car at the ground level. Whereas in socialism, usually the people that own the capital goods are kind of directly involved with and directly invested in their success and in working with them. So you'd have like a worker union that owns a factory. And so the people that are working on the cars do have a sense that they have at least partial ownership and control over the factory. They get to make decisions about their lives. And so the defining feature is the ownership control of capital goods and how that's distributed. And so there aren't, and it's important to understand, this comes in degrees, because as the definition includes, it can be most or all goods. that are controlled this way. So, I mean, not all socialists are necessarily against outlawing all private ownership of, like, say, I mean, if you own like a couple trucks and you have like a trucking business or something akin to Uber, a lot of socialists are probably going to be fine with that, right? Like, you have these things that can be used as capital to create wealth. That's usually fine, partially because it's a smaller scale. You don't have the ability to use that power to like subjugate hundreds of people the same way you do at like an Amazon warehouse. So the most or all distinction is good to make. But it's also important to distinguish that these things do come in degrees. So there aren't really any economic systems in the world that are entirely one or the other. They all have elements of each other in them, and they come in scale. So the countries right now that have more socialist elements would be like Denmark or these Nordic countries, some of which that have like, kind of partial national ownership. So that's the thing too, is there's not necessarily government control. There can be government ownership of means of production if it's public. But the defining feature here, and this is a really important point, is socialism historically, and you'll find outliers to people that may call themselves socialists that are more authoritarian in nature, but they're outliers because the whole point of the socialist tradition has been very pro-democracy, because it's been a pro-workers movement, which is all about workplace democracy. So in a broad sense, it's very philosophically pro-democratic, pro-having, and Chomsky's talked about this too, how we're not against socialists and anarchists aren't against having organization. They're against having top-down organization and power structures that don't have to justify themselves. To believe there's any kind of hierarchy, whether it be in a workplace, a business, or a government, it has to be bottom-up. It has to be constructed by the people whose lives it's going to affect, and has to be kind of endorsed, and it's got to be a bottom-up method of organization. So your socialists are generally going to be very pro-democracy. So when people say things like, oh, well, you're a socialist, well, so whereas this country, X country, that had all this government ownership and they murdered all these people, so it's bad. What's going on there is you're having an equivocation fallacy, because in one premise you mean socialism to be this, what I believe, which is democratic socialism, which is historically and currently a very pro-democracy system that's all about workers' rights, and not even only workers' rights, but even outside the workplace, having a democratic public government in place. And then in the second premise, you mean socialism to be this sort of like centralized top-down authority. You're equivocating on what you mean by socialism. So it's equivocation fallacy logically. So it's important to point out that most of the time when people in America talk about socialism, they're not even talking about the right thing. And even some people on the left even do this. People that are more like Democrats, like when there's corporate bailouts for like Republicans or like for billionaires, they're like, oh, socialism for the rich. That's not socialism. Welfare and corporate bailouts aren't socialism. They are, a means of government distribution. So there's a sense in which that is something socialists may be in favor of for some people. But people often do kind of use the term incorrectly. It's about ownership and control of capital goods, which is in contrast to how capitalists view this. They believe it should be privately owned and controlled, at least mostly or entirely. So does that make sense
No, there are a few important distinctions there. The first one being markets versus planning. So you can have markets. You can even have markets in a socialist system, because socialism, as you're defining it, the sort of democratic socialism, has to do with democratic organization of the workplace.
I should have made that more clear. My bad. Yeah, it is. These are, when you have these definitions about how capital goods are owned and controlled, this is, of course, compatible with a lot of economic theories about how to allocate lesser resources. So yes, for sure. I mean, as far as how free markets should be, you can have that in flux. Because and this is, often people take capitalism just to mean free markets. Like that's kind of the very base level understanding of it, and kind of a little bit more sophisticated, but still not great. People are like, oh, capitalism is just private ownership control. I can start my own business plus free markets. But with the bare definition of capitalism, just as private ownership and control of major means of production, that's compatible with having market regulations, compatible with even a non-market system. And conversely, socialism is completely compatible with having markets to any degree you want. I mean, there are socialists that are completely free market socialists, and there's even a tradition that's pretty big called market socialism, which again comes out of some guys like pretty popular anarchist socialist philosophers like Kevin Carson. So you're right, and you can expound on this a little more if we need to. But yeah, so capitalism and socialism are both compatible with a range of degrees of freedom and control in markets. So socialism, not only is it not synonymous with central planning, it actually can coexist with no central planning at all, and just having market allocation of resources. And generally, socialists are like me, for example, you're kind of standard democratic libertarian socialist, or for like a mixed market, so having socialist control, but having there's a book about this called what money can't buy, the moral limits of markets. I believe it's by Michael Sandel, but I'll have to double check the author name on that. But he basically talks about how there are some things like, children's schools and children's healthcare that we don't want controlled by market. We don't want everything privatized because then it comes down to, usually you're dealing with systems and societies that are too large to do that privately, and that's a more complicated argument. But basically, most socialists are going to be in favor of some sort of mixture of in general, we can have markets allocate resources broadly, but we should have some things that are publicly controlled and taken care of, like necessities like healthcare and education and things like that. So that is an important distinction.
Yeah, that would be, healthcare. I think it's becoming clear even to liberals that healthcare should be a matter of the state and not the markets. But that's the first distinction, is the distinction between planning and markets. And the second distinction that is, in my mind, the crucial one is private versus public or democratic ownership. Mm-hmm. The private ownership, like you said, it's like there's, just like a handful of people who kind of control, to put it in Marxist terms, the means of production, whatever that would be. And what we're envisioning is something that's more democratic. Like if we believe in democracy in matters of state, why wouldn't we believe in it for, matters more private, like in the workplace? So, but the type of socialism that you mentioned, though, that's not democratic, would be sort of a more public or state ownership, as opposed to, private ownership. It's sort of like the government owns industry.
Well, it could still be, yeah.
That is a legitimate form of socialism, I think, but it's different from the democratically motivated type that we're talking about. So there's three types of socialism that we're talking about. There's sort of the markets versus planning distinction, the private versus state distinction, and the private versus democratic ownership distinction.
Sorry, real quick, it's probably important to point out as well, Dustin Crum and I talked about this too, this is an important distinction, that even if you have the means of, like, the capital goods socially owned and controlled by a government, that's not necessarily incompatible with democratic socialism. What you'd have to have there is you'd have to have a government that is in itself also democratic, as well as the economic sphere. So that's what most, sort of contemporary democratic socialists would believe in, is we kind of recognize that you do need a state for planning. So I'm fine with that. I am more of a libertarian socialist. I don't want a huge government if at all possible. But so yeah, that's the important distinction to draw, is you can have even a government or a state owning the means of production. That is compatible with either being that it could be really centralized, or if it's a democratic government, it's a kind of a decentralized, have a bottom-up power structures and voting. So ideally, that's what I was saying, is socialists are very pro-democracy. So even the ones that do advocate for having, say, the government's national, Matt Brunig, for example, as far as has laid out kind of one path towards socialism, is just you have governments go around buying up capital, buying up stocks, buying and nationalizing capital goods until eventually they own enough of it to really be in control of things. But then you kind of use that to either give people universal basic income, or you divide it out to each citizen a little bit. And there are countries like Denmark that are already experimenting with this. So you can have pretty much state ownership of capital goods that's perfectly compatible with having a very democratic socialist system. You just have to have democracy in both spheres. And it's important you mentioned that too, that socialism is all about democracy, whether it's private or public. So so even if the state owns all the means of production, that's not necessarily going to be totalitarian or centralized. At least it shouldn't be. And most socialists would actually be against that kind of vision. That is one possible outcome, of course, but that's not one most socialists want because of their kind of theoretical and political commitments to democracy.
And one thing I just want to warn against, for anyone listening who's maybe sympathetic, is saying that, X wasn't real socialism. Even if you have a clear definition, of socialism that, say, the Soviet Union didn't meet, I just don't think it's a wise tactic. Rather than just, make these distinctions that we're making and talk about what you want.
Yeah.
But there are many branches and manifestations of socialism, just like there are with capitalism. Some people might think that this, sounds complicated, but it's the same thing with capitalism. There are many different types of capitalism. Many self-described capitalists strongly disapprove of certain types of capitalism. I have an Ayn Randian objectivist friend who,
Oh, gross.
he's fun to talk to because it's just kind of funny because we have a similar,
how are you friends with this person? That's crazy.
He's an in-law. He's my brother-in-law. So
okay, yeah, that's, kind of forced into it a little bit, No,
I like him though. It's fun talking to some people who have wildly different views from you.
You're definitely right. You should definitely talk to people, anybody who's any views on the spectrum on this, how politics works, you should definitely engage with all that. So it is funny though to have a Randian, man. That's rough. But
well, he's like he disapproves of the United States. Like he's like, oh, this isn't real capitalism. Like, what we need is more like 18th and 19th century capitalism. And I'm like,
yeah, capitalists do the same line. Yeah, capitalists have the same line. Like, yeah, this is just corporatism, and it's like that's what you get.
Well, but, exactly. It's like this is what happens. But I mean, they're not wrong though that this is corporatism. It's not totally free market capital. Like our economy is like semi-planned.
Exactly. Yeah, and they're right that because they do the same way. Like, well, this isn't real capitalism. Real capitalism would be totally free markets, and it's like, well, no, not by definition. But that's why it's important for both socialists and capitalists to just in detail lay out what you actually believe. That's why the thing of quibbling about terms is it's important to understand terms, but at the end of the day, if you're willing to just ask people what they believe, at a basic level in terms of how things should be structured, that's going to be a lot more productive. Because if I've talked to people before who they're like, oh, you're a socialist, well, you blah blah blah, you're dumb because you believe blah blah blah, and I'm like, look, let's just forget the socialist part. I just think we should have democracy in the workplace. Like, what's the problem with that? So sometimes it is helpful to just sort of like you shed the terminology and just be like, all right, what do you think we should do like structurally? And that can be helpful. So the important thing with any kind of worldview debate is just rather than being too attached to terms, just listening to what people are actually saying. And that's a big part of having any sort of productive political conversation, I think.
Yeah, no, that's my advice as well. Don't bother saying X wasn't real socialism. And honestly, my advice is just don't even start with ideological labels. Just try to start with what you actually think and what, like your sort of vision of what's going on, what's wrong, what needs to be fixed. And then, worry about ideological labels later, because every ideological label comes with a ton of baggage, and like these terms are not precise, these political terms. Yeah, just what?
I don't know why this reminded me of this really funny story. I there was one time, sorry, this is a little bit of a tangent. It's just a funny anecdote. We're talking to people. I ran into some people once at a cigar bar, which, for a while, the law was, when I turned 18, it was 18 still before they introduced the 21 law. So you could still go there. So I was kind of friends with one of the guys there, and he had read some of my like political blog posts and stuff. So I walk in one time and he says to one of his friends, he's like, hey, this is my friend Micah. He's a communist. And they're like, you're a communist? And I was like, I kind of laughed because he was like messing with me. I was like, no, I'm not a communist, but I am a socialist. And they were like, really? And so I started talking to these people, and it turns out the lady was like, yeah, we run the Turning Point USA chapter over at this college. And I was like, damn it. And so there were these two people who were just like, yeah. And so they gave me the stock objections about Cuba and stuff. Like, I came from Cuba and Fidel Castro took my family's slaves and it was horrible. And I'm like, all right.
I was just about to bring that up, dude. There was somebody go ahead.
Sorry. Yeah, it's funny. But the funny thing about it was, I was like, these are the kind of people that like Ben Shapiro. I was like, I'm going to get nowhere. But the funny thing was, when I actually sat down with them and we talked for like 30 minutes about it was actually a pretty fun and productive conversation. And I kind of got to lay out what I thought. And they were like, yeah, that makes sense. And like, you're smart. So this sounds all right. And I was like, yeah, it's good to talk to you guys. So it is funny how like at first I was like Turning Point USA. I was like, I just need to leave. But there was actually like, even though they really didn't, of course, understand they dropped the Cuba thing, I was like, yeah, we're not on the same wavelength here. It was still rather productive. And I was like, as long as it can help people, these kind of two random people that I'm never going to see again, understand like what socialists actually think, like I've done my job, So that was helpful. But yeah, no, what were you going to say about that?
Well, I mean, kudos to you for actually having the conversation and not just like shutting it down or refusing to have the debate. That is not going to get us anywhere. Especially with a fringe position. Well, I mean, fringe at least in terms of people who actually want to take on the label. I'm not sure that socialist beliefs. I don't think socialist beliefs are all that fringe. But yeah, I was going to mention the Democrats just recently elevated someone. It was just a few months ago. They were elevating someone on social media who was just like, a lot of young kids think that socialism is cool these days. But my family had to, leave Cuba because of, the tyrant Fidel Castro. And then like, so, obviously it's like social media, so you can look into a person and like get their info pretty easily. So it took Twitter all of 2 hours to find out that this lady's grandpa owned a slave plantation.
Oh my God.
And that's why they had to flee. It's like Castro took my slave plantation. It's like, good.
That's so funny because I'm like, that's a meme. So I was like, I kind of was joking, but I'm sure that's so funny, man.
It's tyranny. They took my slaves.
The evil communists stopped us from owning people. Yeah.
But
it's beautiful.
We touched on some of my like core issues with capitalism in there, but the roots of my opposition to capitalism would have to be like my support for democracy. Like I thought that being pro-democratic was so unobjectionable. Like when I started becoming politically active, like in 2014 or 2015, like I just sort of followed these democratic principles, like where they seemed to lead. And, I was surprised to find out that many people didn't want to do that. Like they were willing to sort of renounce democracy in favor of capitalism. And, it doesn't actually take that much work to show that there's a conflict between the two. That like you can't really have a, capitalist democracy because capitalism leads to concentration of wealth. And, concentration of wealth is inherently incompatible with a democratic power structure. So you're going to have to choose one or the other. I actually have a quote from Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis here. We may have democracy, or we may have wealth concentrated in the hands of a few, but we can't have both.
That's awesome, yeah.
And of course, anyone who's familiar with Chomsky will know that a lot of this is coming from him and coming from Requiem for the American Dream specifically.
I love that. Yeah, I love that documentary. It's like free on YouTube right now, so everybody should go watch it. There's also a book, of course, but definitely watch the like hour-long documentary. It's amazing.
That it was so enlightening. It just felt like fog had been lifted when I first found Chomsky. Like after I had been like working for maybe like 6 months and like I was experiencing like alienation and all this like frustration and like but just couldn't put it into words. Like I didn't have the language to express like what I was thinking and like what was going on. And then I saw that documentary because it was about like I saw it like when it came out basically. And it just put to words like what I'd been feeling and just about how I thought the country worked and everything. And it was just like, yeah, I just started like consuming Noam Chomsky videos and like reading his books.
Yep,
and I would not shut up about him for like 2 years after that.
I still think I haven't. Yeah, my philosophy club, my school, like knows I'm known for just like bringing up Chomsky whenever possible. I still haven't shut up about him.
Like I remember being at a bar with a friend and just like I was like, well, it's been 15 minutes since I've mentioned Noam Chomsky, so I'm going to bring him up again really quick. But,
have like an intervention, like, hey man, like we get it, but you need to stop with the Chomsky. You have to at least take 20-minute breaks.
And while we're on Chomsky, another thing he brought my attention to on this whole democracy versus capitalism question was the fact that this is an issue that was discussed in ancient Greece, which I guess shouldn't be surprising because it seems like they talked about pretty much everything. Aristotle mentioned how if we had real democracy, then the poor would kind of unite to take the property of the rich. And his solution to that was to take care of the material needs of enough people so that wouldn't happen. And James Madison, founding father, his solution was to reduce democracy. But, they both are effective. But the point being that this is recognized way before socialism was ever a thing. There's a tension between mass inequality, which capitalism produces, and democracy. And
right, yeah, for sure.
I guess there are two directions I want to go right now. One's about equality and one's about democracy. So I guess I'll start with democracy. We keep mentioning, like democracy in the workplace. And just to be clear, what we mean by that is, that in opposition to private ownership. So instead of a few people who are making all the decisions about, what to produce, where to produce, what to do with the surplus, that would be a democratic matter, as opposed to those decision-making powers concentrated in the hands of a few people. And the thing is, if you have arguments against, for instance, like hereditary monarchy, which, obviously has all kinds of different connotations, but if you just kind of strip away all the proper nouns and such, what you're left with is immense concentrated power that's handed to people because of their, the situation of their birth. And the thing is, that is not that different from what we have now.
In some cases, it's exactly the same with some sort of, like sometimes with inheritances and power, like, yeah. So in some cases, it's not all that different. Some cases, it's not different at all.
My reasons for opposing private ownership are literally the same reasons I oppose hereditary monarchy.
Yeah.
And like, if you believe in democracy for the state, then why don't you believe in it for the private sector? Like, what exactly is the difference? Why can we just change the words here and suddenly your values change? I feel like I'm just being consistently democratic. So,
you are.
Yeah. And the other thing I wanted to mention is that sometimes capitalists will say, well, look, inequality is not bad in and of itself. And I think that that's in some ways a red herring, because we're not talking about minor inequality here. Like, we're talking about, billionaires, while there are people who have to work like multiple jobs and take out tons of debt and that sort of thing. So I'm not talking about the difference between like 30K a year and 130K a year. I'm talking about like billionaires. The thing is, the reason inequality is bad is because it's a threat to democracy. You cannot have concentrated wealth and democracy. You have to choose one or the other. And, just that issue aside, when you have, say, like a handful of trillionaires and everyone else has to take out debt and everyone else is in trouble, like I think that is a bad state of affairs. I don't think we should have that. And it's a choice to keep things that way. It's not a law of nature, and it would be a choice to change it. But I guess that does kind of lead us to another socialist canard, or anti-socialist canard rather, which is that socialism doesn't mean that everyone is exactly the same. Like everyone, it's more like there are no homeless people or poor people and there are no billionaires.
Yeah, well, yeah. So there's a couple of good things to touch on here. I mean, I think you're absolutely right, and this is the big thing. It sounds like we've had similar journeys in terms of coming to understanding this, of just being like, if I want to be consistently democratic, like pro-democracy, and advocate for people having control over their lives, I should advocate for that as well in terms of the private sector. And maybe we'll address this more later, but there's also a lot to be said about the connection between concentration of power in the private sector and in the state. A lot of times people like, your kind of Tea Party libertarians or a lot of conservatives want to like say that those are separate, and like or at least if they don't say it explicitly, their ideology makes it separate. But of course, that's just not how, again, back to Chomsky's work as well as others, in terms of, it's very simple to see how much corporate power influences politics. For one thing, just with mass media, when you have, a couple companies that own like all the major media channels. I mean, there was like example, like Rob Larson talks about this in his book, Capitalism versus Freedom. But in Mexico, when they deregulated one of their markets for like networking, well, now there's like one guy that owns like 90% of the media network. So basically, whatever politicians he supports and policies he supports, which are obviously the ones that are going to benefit him and not the people, are the ones that
could you imagine living in a society like that?
Yeah, that'd be horrible, man. I mean, at least we have like 3 or 4 guys instead of 1, but it's not that much better. But there's a lot to be, I mean, we can talk about this more later. I won't go on that too much, but it's also just, I think it's important to point out that when you try to draw this distinction sharply between like, I'm pro-democracy in our political institutions, but I'm still, think we should have these sort of top-down structures. And there are arguments to the effect that that's different and like why we should have that. I don't think they're good arguments, and we can talk about that a little bit more. But as far as, there's also an interesting conversation to be had about inequality and like what makes it bad. And this will bleed into what we're talking about here with making people equal. Because socialism is not necessarily synonymous with egalitarianism, but most socialists are egalitarians, and egalitarianism this is from the Oxford Dictionary of Political Philosophy, is just the doctrine that moral and political life should be aimed at respecting and advancing the equality of persons. And people often equivocate on equality here. As far as another resource for this, as far as like, well, is inequality bad? Because there are these people that just want to say, well, inequality is not bad, or at least not intrinsically bad. I'm not sure it's intrinsically bad. I mean, I lean towards thinking it is, but the arguments to that effect are kind of tough to make. But if nothing else, you can argue that the consequences of inequality, what you were talking about, like how it leads to kind of very unequal, like the inequality of persons leads to these very sort of totalitarian systems of control, whether it be governmental or private. So there are at least good reasons to think inequality is bad because of the effects it produces. And Tim Scanlon he wrote one of the most important books of moral philosophy, the What Do We Owe Each Other? But he also has a book called What's So Bad About Inequality? That's part of the Uhuro series on practical ethics. And he also on Philosophy Bites, the podcast Philosophy Bites, he has like a 20-minute interview he talks briefly about the book and arguments to the effect that inequality is bad and it's something we should reduce. So there are, and of course the seminal kind of work, or like one of the cornerstone works on egalitarian philosophy and equality, is Elizabeth Anderson has an essay called What's the Point of Inequality, or What's the Point of Equality? The one I would recommend, though, for people to start is Dustin Crum and I talk about this a little bit on both my interviews with him on equality and how socialists understand it. Because usually, again, egalitarianism and socialism are not necessarily synonymous, but usually egalitarians are committed to some form of socialism just because that's, the best way to advance equality. So Dustin Crummett, actually, you can find on his website, which I link on my channel, my discussions with him. He has a paper in the Ethics Left and Right compendium on like introducing a leftist worldview and framework, and he talks in there about like why we value equality and how to best advance it. And it's my favorite philosophy paper I've ever read. It's very good. So I'd recommend that. But I talk with him in both my interviews with him about equality itself and like why, because sometimes you'll have, again, libertarians object. They'll say like, well, obviously equality is not good. I don't want, because there's sort of this classic essay. A lot of people view equality in this kind of caricatured way. There's this classic essay called Harrison Bergeron.
I was literally just about to bring that up.
Yeah, it's an important one. Dustin brought it up too. It's like, a lot of people they're like, oh, well, equality, well, that would be like in this essay where all the attractive people have to wear bags and the athletic people have to wear rocks on their backs to make themselves, like, everybody's got to be equaled out. And the guy who, again, like with Orwell, the guy who wrote that essay was a socialist as well. So when libertarians are like, hey, obviously, here's why we can't have socialism, it's like, dude, no egalitarian philosopher, like if you look at G.A. Cohen and Elizabeth Anderson, like the big names in terms of egalitarianism, they've never defended anything that looks remotely like this view of equality. They've defended a kind of like political and economic equality that has to do with moral worth and the power you have to control your life and your value in political systems. So nobody's ever, so when we talk about equality, like what you're saying, nobody's meaning this like I saw like in Dustin, like a Facebook thread once, Dustin was like, yeah, your critique basically boils down to equality is bad because not everybody should have the equal right to sleep in my bed. Because the person online was using the example of like, well, we don't have the equal rights to play in the NBA. Some people just have more talents. And of course, socialists and egalitarians understand that people have different talents and are better suited for different tasks. But that doesn't have anything to do with any sort of moral or political equality. And no egalitarian philosophers ever defended a view like that. So there are good reasons to think inequality is bad because of the effects it produces, both on people's psychological lives and on their lives day to day in terms of their well-being, economically, politically, and in every sense. So there's a lot to say about equality and inequality and what makes them bad. I don't know if we need to, if you want to, we can go a little bit more into, why we value equality, but that's a good, I think, like sort of brief overview.
Well, I was going to mention Harrison Bergeron by Kurt Vonnegut, who's one of my favorite authors. Probably my favorite fiction author, at least top 3, but he actually wrote Harrison Bergeron as a satirical depiction of how anti-socialists view socialism. Like that was the point.
It worked too well, yeah.
Exactly. It was kind of funny. He's a true ironist because he didn't really like go on a campaign to correct everyone. He was just like, someone brought it up one time and they asked him about it, and he was like, well, I don't agree with that interpretation, but it's yours to have if you want it. But
the guy who wrote it, you're like, I interpret it this way, and he's like, whatever, man, I wrote it.
Well, that was funny. He was kind of a postmodernist, at least in terms of like literature, and he was just like, well, it's up to you, I guess. But speaking of that, though, speaking of the postmodern neo-Marxists, a sort of
that we obviously are, we're definitely.
It's more of a like modern objection. It seems to be mostly associated with our boy Jordan Peterson, who, he talks about equality of opportunity versus equality of outcome. And I just don't know
everybody who uses that distinction thinks they're a genius. It's like those memes you see the person with like the head that's like 10 times your size. It's like, that's how libertarians feel when they're like, oh, well, equality of opportunity or equality of outcome. And they're like, and like they think they've won. And like, I can't forgive Peterson for that one. People think that's a great, like that's just a clincher. And it's like, man, ugh.
Do you know anyone who advocates for like totally like Harrison Bergeron equality of outcome? Because I literally can't name a single person.
Never. I mean, like political philosophers, definitely not. Random person online, not even. That's one of those things where like you'd expect to have found some random guy online who was like, yeah, we should just all. No, I've never seen anybody even on like crackpots online defend that kind of view, because even those people I think realize you could maybe find some like just totally high like communist who's like, yeah, man, we should just all get the exact same thing. But even communists don't necessarily believe that. So, I've never, and as far as political philosophers, not even close. Nobody even understands equality that way, much less, advocates for like a total equality of outcome. I mean, nobody believes that. And the part about equality of opportunity is central to an egalitarian case. But nobody defends anything like that, at least that I've seen, and I don't think anyone ever will, because it's sort of just straightforwardly ludicrous. But it's how a lot of people understand leftist ideals, which is kind of speaks more to their psyche than ours, I guess.
Right. Yeah. Capitalists have gotten very flabby in their arguments. But I mean, just on that last point, like I know more than one person who defends Stalin and I don't know anyone who defends equality of outcome. Like,
yeah.
it's not a position that anyone, and like they try to support it with like certain, like the people who seem to be saying if there's not exactly 50% men and 50% women, like in a given occupation, then that must be, the result of like sexism or something. And I think that's more what they're after. Like, if there's not a perfect equality of outcome, then, this must be the explanation. But that's more like
liberals. I can see like modern Democrats going that sort of way, where they're like, all our drones on Syria should be dropped by half men, half women. Like that's sort of like I can see liberals going that route easier than I can see actual leftists going that route.
Oh, they already have. I mean, like
in some sense, yeah.
Yeah, no, it's that satire, just like the Cuba thing. Like it works because it's based in truth, and then like in our just increasingly bizarre reality, all these things that used to be jokes are just like coming true. But yeah, no, I mean, that does seem to be what the Democrats are moving toward. We mentioned this before we started recording, that it's possible to be very, very progressive on like cultural and social issues and very, very anti-socialist, as manifested in the Democratic Party.
Yeah, pretty much. They're not even like entirely progressive. I mean, they are like nominally where they need to be, but to get votes, but they're, it's not like any of them are, really invested in like gender studies and like philosophy or like reading Kate Mann or anything. But they're kind of just sort of like nominally going with, because it's a voter thing, right? They say, oh, young people are actually cool with gay marriage now. We need to like, or a lot of them are usually like at least somewhat pro-choice as well. But yeah, no, definitely nothing. You can definitely be a progressive without being a socialist. Most of your socialists are pretty progressive, though, at least the ones that I've seen. But and it's funny, yeah, no, they're definitely like tankies is a big thing. People defend like Stalin or Lenin or Mao even. Like, yeah, I've seen Maoists, but I've not seen any like people who actually defend that sort of view of equalities. That is pretty funny. That's how crazy it is.
So while we're dealing with other idiotic canards, aren't you just jealous of rich people?
Yeah, so what it comes down to, I've dressed it up all this philosophy. It's really just envy, man. I wish I could, do coke. I wish I could just do cocaine on my yacht and not have to worry about anything else. That'd be awesome.
Right, well, you didn't have to pick a cool example. I mean, we don't need to besmirch the good name of people who do cocaine. I mean, not that true, I would.
Yeah, I mean, right.
Of course,
if you're doing cocaine on a yacht, like for fun, and like you get the chance, like go for that. Obviously, you're gonna give it a shot. But
I'm admitting to nothing right now.
Yeah, no. I was like, should have picked a less cool example, like drugs and like, yeah, man, if you want to have drugs and do sex, wait, you should do that anyways. Wait a minute. I think I just said have drugs and do sex.
I noticed that you said do sex. Yeah.
That was awesome. Oh, dude, that's such like a frat boy. Like, I do the sex all the time. Yeah, no.
Dude, I've done so much sex. You have no clue.
You have no idea. Oh, it's too funny. But so there is, I mean, I don't know if it's necessarily like, obviously we all have moments of like envy of people that things work out. But honestly, like a lot of times with rich people, I feel more of like I don't know. There's the other version of that, people like, you just hate rich people. And I'm like, well, kind of, but not, that's not why I'm not a socialist, because I hate rich people. I hate rich people because I'm a socialist. Get it right here. There's a thing too, is like a lot of socialists, when you ask them like, what they care about, it's going to be about like, they're going to go, their first point is going to be talking about like, oh, there's people that are homeless or sick or dying, they need health care. It's not like, well, we should all be, on yachts doing sex or living in these monstrous houses. I mean, everybody gets jealous of, plenty wealth at some point, I guess. But I think more of the socialist ethos comes down to a kind of like an anger at that, not necessarily at the people for like being successful, but for the fact that their success at the expense of others, like not even necessarily at the expense of others, but the fact that they have so much success and now they could do good things with it and they just choose not to. So, I mean, it's kind of a point where like, it doesn't matter. Like, even if we do envy rich people, so what? Like, we're still like, we're not advocating everybody live that lifestyle. We're saying like, hey, you're living that lifestyle, and while you're doing that, there's like a ton of people in poverty, 60% of whom are either elderly, sick, or children that can't work. So, maybe we should change things up a little bit. And, like the hatred to like eat the rich, like, oh, you just hate rich people. You're just envious and angry, and that's why you're a socialist. And it's like, I mean, I am angry at how the world is structured, because it's immensely unfair to people who have not really had a chance to do anything else. And they're just, they're stuck working to pay bills or whatever, pay off student loans, pay medical bills. I mean, you can get screwed over so easily with one little thing going wrong. And there is like a little bit of resentment towards people who but I think that's healthy, right? Like, why is that an argument against socialism? Like, if you're not angry, I mean, why wouldn't you be angry that there's 3 guys that own more wealth than the bottom 50% of Americans, and now with coronavirus there's like 700,000 people out of jobs? Like, why? How can you look at the world as it is and not be angry? Like, I think there's something wrong with your moral compass if you're not a little bit outraged at how things are right now. As far as envy, it's sort of a side point. It's like, sure, maybe some people are envious of the rich, but I mean, being envious of rich people doesn't necessarily yield any immediate political conclusions. A lot of people that are envious of rich people tend to be capitalists who are like, well, that'll be me one day. I'll be a billionaire. And it's like, no, you're going to be making $40,000 a year the rest of your life. But, keep posting entrepreneurial stuff on Instagram.
Yeah, so, it's all about your mindset. You just got to get your mindset right, and then you'll be a millionaire. But
yeah, exactly. Once you get, clean your room, and then you can, go do your job at the, at Target or whatever, and you'll eventually just, be Jeff Bezos.
Yeah, that'll show those poor.
Why are you cheering, Fry? You're not rich.
True, but someday I might be rich, and then people like me better watch their step.
So yeah, it's one of those funny points where it's like, oh, you just don't like rich people. I mean, I don't, but there's a lot of reasons for that. And so what if people are envious? There's nothing that comes from that. And most of the people are capitalists anyways. So
yeah, exactly. It's mostly projection from capitalists who are just, you're envious of rich people. And like and like I said,
you aren't, yeah.
Yeah, it's like, I guess I'm envious of the fact that when they get sick, they get to go to the hospital. I mean, I guess envy is one way to characterize that, but there, like you said, there are more reasons to hate rich people than envy. And like I said, it kind of, or like you said, it kind of exposes some kind of deficiency, I would say, in their understanding of others. If they think the only possible reason that you could be mad that there are people dying of cured diseases is just envy that you're not on a yacht doing cocaine. It's like, there's true horrors in this country. And it's just like, again, it's a choice. We choose to make it this way. And as I mentioned earlier, my reasons for opposing private ownership are the same reasons I oppose a hereditary monarchy. I mean, like, you might as well say, like, aren't you just jealous of the monarchs? You could have said that.
You wish you were born into that bloodline and you get to go to all the regal parties. It's like, maybe, but I think there's some other problems here.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, it would just be like accusing like Thomas Paine or someone of being jealous of the monarchs. It's like, you are just not understanding.
There were those people. There were those people. There were liberals back then. They were like, you just wish you were the king. And we're like, yeah.
Yeah, they can't understand that. Like, no, I just don't want anyone to be the king. I don't want anyone to be a billionaire because it's incompatible with democracy.
Yeah, that's the thing. That's a good point too to bring up. The socialists, not even sensible people should be like, hey, billionaires shouldn't be a thing. Nobody needs that much money. So yeah, not only are we not necessarily envious of billionaires, it's like, no, I don't want them to exist. I don't want to be one because I don't think that like position in the social or economic ladder should even be a thing that's real.
So let's talk about the Soviet Union. Okay, so we mentioned a couple of things like, X wasn't real socialism, and even if you have a clear definition of socialism, just, don't say that. Just say, yes, the Soviet Union was one manifestation of socialism, just like the United States is one manifestation of capitalism. This is not the only way to do capitalism. That wasn't the only way to do socialism. Let's just talk about socialism not working, because I think this is probably one of the more common things that I hear of just like, show me one place where this has worked. Socialism doesn't work.
That's true. People, I posted a video on my YouTube. My actually most recently uploaded video was just like a minute long. I was like, hey, why aren't you a socialist? Just let me know and let me help. So I was like, I've made a couple short videos. Like, I want to do more. And like, because all the objections people have are totally covered in my video with Dustin, but it's 2 hours long. And so I can't just link it. So I wanted to make some some bite-sized, 5-minute videos on like the points that are really popular. And I got some really garbage responses. Like one guy was like, well, because I'm a Burkean conservative. And I was like, well, you're a lost cause already. Because, you could say you made that exact argument like before slavery. It's just being like, I'm a Burkean. I think we should, stick with things that are familiar. It's like, no, you should never preserve traditions for the sake of traditions. You should preserve things that are valuable as they are and, dismantle things that are not. So there's no intrinsic moral worth or normative worth to things that already exist above and beyond any other independent reason you have for valuing them, right? Like, it's completely stupid to just say, well, the things that we have established are better just because they're already established. I mean, if we had stuck with that from the founding of the country, we'd still have slavery and women wouldn't be able to vote. And maybe some conservatives are cool with that. But by and large, it's just a horrible way to view politics. Is and David Bentley Hart, the Christian socialist theologian, actually has a really great quote about this. He said something like, the true conservatives I've known in my life seem to be they're struck with a bilious resentment of any sort of social change, and they're stuck in a vision of the past they think only they understand and can see. Progress isn't necessarily intrinsically good. Progressing away from a good thing to a bad thing isn't good, but things are valuable independently of whether they're progress or tradition. You have to evaluate them, on their own merits. But as far as the point about what socialism doesn't work, so a lot of the questions I got here, people are like, well, what's an example of a socialist system? And as we talked about towards the beginning, these things come in degrees. And there was actually a good current affairs article that went through some of the data on this. It's called Why Socialism Works. And he said, there's no countries that exist right now that are completely socialist, but there are countries that are on a scale of socialism and capitalism are more socialist and less socialist, and ones that are more socialist tend to do better. And you look at a lot of the Nordic countries and some places in Europe and even Canada, and that's kind of borne out by the data. And he goes through some of the data on that.
Well, let me stop you there, though. I mean, doing better in terms of what?
Oh, yeah, sorry, that's vague. In terms of happiness overall, in terms of people's quality of life and how they're reported, that's the main thing. But also in terms of certain things like economic growth, there's been better and provisions for people by the government, so things like healthcare, and there's not really come at a cost. Violence, even, there's lesser degrees.
Right, but a lot of these things are sort of human, needs. Like what I hear a lot of these times when people bring this up, they'll say oh, these countries do better, and then by some measures they do worse. But you need to sort of dig into what that means, because socialist countries, or countries that are more socialist rather, they do better in terms of, like you said, happiness and health, things that matter to human beings. But the thing is, they are worse by some measures. There's less concentrated wealth, there are fewer billionaires. And to some people, they think that that's worse.
Oh, yeah. I get what you mean, yeah. So that gets into, if we're talking about, I mean, they're better in terms of if you want things like more concentrated wealth, yeah. So I guess that's true. But I mean, in terms of just the systems, that article by Current Affairs is good just for the simple point of quote unquote working, in the sense that they have functioning economies that do well, don't collapse. And because people have this vision that as soon as you implement socialism, it's just going to be Venezuelan, you're just going to have poverty, hunger. So that's the sense in which that articles like that are helpful, and just saying no, countries that are more socialist on this scale people aren't starving, there aren't bread lines. People aren't out of jobs. There's a generally well-functioning economy. People report being happy. There's, GDPs, everything. So articles like that are good for the simple. We're treating quote unquote works in a very broad sense. Sometimes capitalists do when they say socialism doesn't work, they mean it literally cannot function.
Exactly.
So it can't function at all, or it'll only function badly, or they again think Venezuelan or USSR, which again, the USSR had the quickest growing economy of all time. So I mean, it worked in a purely economic sense, but at a moral level, it was pretty horrible. And that's sort of similar in there's other countries that are like that even now. But so it's also important to dig into how people mean works when they ask the question, when they're well, when has socialism ever worked? I mean, there's never really been a nationalized, a full, democratic socialist government, completely. Again, there are systems that are more and less so. And again, the democratic part is important because, again, what they have in Venezuela and even in the USSR you were talking about, there was still lots of private ownership and control, and it was very totalitarian. That nothing like the democracy that socialists are in favor of, what we've been talking about. So when people say socialism doesn't work, it's important to pinpoint what they mean, because, again, most of the time all they mean is centrally planned economies and totalitarian governments are bad. And it's yeah, we all agree on that. So that's not what we're advocating at all.
Right.
So I guess when we're talking about how we should answer this objection, it's important to be well, what is the objection? Is the objection that centrally planned economies are not good? I mean, to an extent, that's right. Is it that social welfare programs are bad? Because again, most of the time people are talking about socialism, we're talking about just general social welfare, social democracy type stuff. So is it that general social welfare programs aren't bad, universal healthcare is bad? That's all not true. We can, again, for that stuff, for a lot of these points, we can look at other countries and be no, universal health care or universal basic income or job security, workers' unions. There are all these examples of these kind of things that socialists are in favor of working. as far as having a socialist system, like completely, again, look at countries that, like, I think it's Denmark. I might get this wrong. I might be getting the name wrong, but I think it's Denmark. It's like 60% national control of private means of production. I mean, there are countries that have pretty heavily socialist elements that are not only functioning well, they're doing very well, and let's just go with the bare minimum, they're working. So in terms of,
and they're working better than we are in terms of, human well-being, even though there has been this tragic loss of freedom, of course. But
of course. If you have healthcare, if you're paying a little bit more taxes to have healthcare and better roads, you're definitely not free. Yeah. So I don't know. I don't know if you want to like take that objection anywhere else, but I mean, it's hard to respond to it because a lot of times it's either, again, it's all about these just social welfare programs, which they very clearly do work if you look at every other industrialized country in the world, or it's just, well, central planning and totalitarian governments like the Stalinists, like that doesn't work. And it's like, sure, I don't want that system either. We can be in agreement. Or like North Korea or whatever.
Right.
I don't want that either. So we can agree on that and let's go from there. So It depends on what's actually being objected to there. It's like, so it's either going to be just a complete and total non-issue. It's like, no, that's a straw man. That's not what I believe. Don't have to worry about it. Or it's just, well, no, actually giving people healthcare does work in the sense that, and there's a lot of scientific data on this too. The Science Versus podcast did a whole episode comparing the American health system to England's and how, like, scientifically England's is better. And England is one of, like, the not as good ones in Europe. Like, England is one of the kind of worse European healthcare systems. Like, the Nordic countries like Sweden, Norway, Denmark are way better. And so they went on, like, one of the bare minimum European countries and compared it to the United States, and even that was better. So the data bears out a lot of social welfare programs, quote unquote, working. So I don't know. Do you want to take that one anywhere else? Or
I mean, just the thing you said at the end there, I just wanted to mention, because it's inevitably weight lines are brought up whenever you mention the NHS or anything like that. The thing is, like, in the US, we have weight lines too. It's just you never get to the front if you don't have money.
Right.
Like, there are lots of people who need healthcare and they never get it. Whereas, with something like the NHS, the line is organized by, the severity and by need, not by ability to pay. Like,
right. So there are weight lines for things like really, like, traumatic, maybe surgeries, but like things that are, or I might be getting it backwards, but there are weight lines for some things, but there are less weight lines for others. Some things that are like immediate, and it's also cheaper to get things like insulin. So a lot of things that are more immediate threats or like emergencies, like there's not weight lines for the really important stuff. But yeah, I mean, if you got to wait a little bit to go to a doctor's visit, but it's free at point of service, it's like, what are you complaining about? So that's definitely important to talk about as well with that point. So that podcast episode is really good on that.
If you have some kind of life-threatening thing and you just walked in, then you get moved to the front of the line. Whereas if yours is like, a knee surgery, then you don't get moved to the front of the line. So it's organized.
Yeah, if it can wait. Yeah.
Right. So anyway, we have weight lines here too, is all I'm saying. It's just organized by ability to pay instead of by the severity or, the time sensitiveness.
Yeah, and sometimes you're not even on a weight line because you realize, you're like, wow, if I go to the doctor, I'm going to be bankrupt, so I'm just going to have to live with this. So sometimes there's weight lines, and sometimes it's like, well, I just can't afford to go to the doctor. So
right.
So really want that.
I do just want to tackle the USSR though head on, because that is, I don't want to just completely disavow it, because, it was a socialist country, and I ultimately think it was a bad thing that it collapsed. But to say that it doesn't work is just incorrect. Like, they went from a backwards, agrarian, poor society to the world's number 2 superpower in 50 years.
It definitely worked.
That's not what not working looks like. In 50 years, they went from that to the space age. So I'm not quite sure what people mean when they say it doesn't work. Like, socialism doesn't work, but the USSR defeated the Nazis, ended rationing before the UK and experienced the fastest economic growth of any country in the 20th century, and became the number 2 world superpower afterwards. But just to back up that little USSR defeated the Nazis thing, I believe they
flood them with bodies, like just a lot of troops.
Oh yeah, I mean, the US lost, I think, 400,000 troops, and the USSR lost, I think, 20 million. And
something like that, yeah.
Yeah, and I believe that 8 out of 10 Nazi kills were from Soviet soldiers.
Sounds about right.
Yeah.
There's also, I mean, America's plan was a little bit different. The Soviets were like, we'll flood them with people. The Americans were like, we'll flood them with like really cheap weaponry, just like really cheap tanks that are going to get, but like, we have a lot of them because we can mass produce them. And the Soviets were like, well, we got a lot of people. And so.
Well, I mean, when the Soviet Union fell and transitioned to capitalism in the years that immediately followed, they experienced the sharpest drop in life expectancy in modern history. And like there were articles in the New York Times pondering this strange fact and like wondering if the Russians were like psychologically deficient in some way and they like couldn't handle, their newfound wonderful freedoms. But it couldn't possibly be that the sudden transition to capitalism harmed life expectancy. Like that
of course not that, yeah.
No. And like, it's just so funny because this is even reflected today, between the US and like other Western European countries, even the US and Cuba, which is a tiny, poor island nation. And like, they still beat us in some areas.
Or like the fact that like a lot of problems with countries like that and Venezuela even have resulted from invasions and like sanctions and like all kinds of like economic blockades. And I mean, Reagan carried out like a terror war that killed like 20,000 people in Cuba. Like we've had a lot to do with why these countries are messed up with, and we've supported coups we supported a lot of military coups all over the world that have taken out instantiated elected leaders and then replaced it with a right-wing dictator. So yeah, I mean, socialism isn't going to work if every socialist gets assassinated by the CIA or something. But yeah, no, I mean, it's an important point too to like point out, because there's all sorts of just misinformation about all this stuff. And it is, I mean, Chomsky is a great antidote to misinformation on this in terms of like the presidents and Jeff McMahon, even the applied ethicist, has a book called Reagan and the World. A lot of these countries' problems, both the ones near us and the ones even in the Middle East, a lot of their problems have to do with kind of political intervention, that we've carried out coups there, invasions, or we've backed coups, backed invasions, backed politicians. And that's not like an outlier in terms of the history of American imperialism. So yeah, no, there's a lot. It's a lot more complicated than just like, well, obviously leftism doesn't work. There's also this thing like anything, remotely left wing of neoliberal capitalism is just called communism. And then there's the distinction like, well, communism killed 100 million people, which is a lie that comes from this thing called the Black Book of Communism, that one of the guys that wrote it was obsessed with getting to that number. And like a lot of his co-authors even came out and said like the data was done really poorly. For one thing, the definitions of communism, and but even philosophers like Mike Humer have like written like opinion pieces on Marx, talking about how like Marxism has led to the death of 100 million people. And it's like, no, it hasn't.
So we were talking about the USSR there, and how
we're talking about how that it actually does work.
Yeah, and how it actually did work pretty well. But the thing that you brought up is just that we've invaded and interfered in violent and nonviolent ways throughout the entire history of socialism. Like when you look at Vietnam to Indonesia to the USSR to Cuba to many South American nations, like the US intervened peacefully and very frequently violently, with extreme brutality. And the original objection was socialism doesn't work. Well, then why the need for military intervention? Like if socialism doesn't work, then why not just let it fail? Exactly. Just let it collapse on its own. Why has there never been, literally there's never been in history, a major socialist project that capitalists and fascists didn't try to crush? Capitalism is the only system that works and will kill you if you try something else. Like it doesn't make sense. Like it puts the lie to the whole, socialism doesn't work objection. Like, I don't know how thinking people can hold these two thoughts in their head at the same time, that capitalism is the only system that works and it's necessary to kill people who want to try something else.
And as we talked about again towards the beginning, it's like capitalism works. Like, are we looking at the same shit? Like, what is your criteria for work? It's like having to be bailed out like every few years because the economy bursts and like people are left without jobs, or like in 2008, some people left without homes just because one day things burst. Like, capitalism works? What do you mean works? Like,
yeah, we're just like accelerating like towards climate disaster. Like we have people living people living in massive debt. The number of suicides is increasing dramatically, and they're just like, look, like, do you really think this is the best we can do? Like, I guess that's my main question for anti-socialists is like,
that would be a horrible way to view the world. I can't imagine like looking around at things being like, yeah, this is the ideal scenario. Like the only reason I can like get up in the morning some days because I'm like, we can make things better.
There are a lot of people who I think are sympathetic to that basic idea, but maybe not to socialism, partly because they don't know what it is. But I think that there are people who are kind of post-capitalist, at least implicitly, in the sense that they think we can do better and that it's necessary to try to do something better. Like, even people who are, like we were talking earlier about sort of the IDW types, like Eric Weinstein, for instance, like, he actually is some kind of post-capitalist. I don't think a lot of his fans realize this, but, he does think that and he's one of the only people in the, intellectual dark web, or the intellectual dork web, as Joe Rogan calls it, who actually thinks that, like, look, capitalism is failing and we have to move to something else. Like, it's over. Like, we need to try something else now. And it's just very funny to see, like, that not compute with his fans. Like, I remember a couple of years ago, I was like watching a video of him, Ben Shapiro, Jordan Peterson, and Dave Rubin.
Oh God!
The big four, all talking about.
Yeah, this sounds like one of the circles of hell. I'd have to like sit in here, and you can't talk. You have to listen. I'd like just kill me.
It was. I got like halfway through it. I think it was. But it was so funny because like Eric Weinstein was saying all these things about like the failure of capitalism, and it was like, Jordan Peterson just like was sort of in his own world. It didn't seem like it was really clicking with him.
That's normal.
Yeah, and then like Dave Rubin is just sitting there with drool coming out of one side of his mouth, and and then Ben Shapiro, like, as dumb as he is sometimes, like he seemed to actually get that, Eric was like criticizing capitalism and saying that it was necessary to move beyond it. Yeah, it's interesting because the IDW is, pretty profoundly anti-socialist. Everyone from like Sam Harris and which, not hard to figure out why a trust fund kid might be anti-socialist. But that actually, I wanted to bring this up too, the whole skeptical movement and this sort of anti-socialist tendency in the skeptical movement, because, it wasn't always that way. Like, I just found a clip recently of Carl Sagan, who's like a godfather of the skeptical movement.
I've seen this.
And, he was just asked on CNN, like, are you a socialist? And then he just kind of dodged it and was like, I don't know what socialist means. And then he proceeded to describe why American capitalism is destroying lives. And
I think I saw that clip the other day. He basically was just like, well, he's like, I don't know what that means, but like, I think the government should take care of their people, and like, and we're not doing that. And I was like, all right, we can be on the same side.
Yeah. And he highlighted something that, we've touched on like a dozen times so far, that it is a choice that things are the way they are by the people in power, and we allow them to be in power and to be the way that they are. And he was just saying, like, we have a horrible infant mortality rate, worse than some communist countries. He's like, that's a choice. The reason that they have a better infant mortality rate is because they care more. Yeah, he said they care more about their infants than we do. That's it.
Well, are you a socialist?
I'm not sure what a socialist is, but I believe that the government has a responsibility to care for the people. I'm not talking about dole. I'm talking about making people self-reliant, people able to take care of themselves. There are countries which are perfectly able to do that. The United States is an extremely rich country. It's perfectly able to do that. It chooses not to. It chooses to have homeless people. We are 19th in the world in infant mortality. 18 other countries save the lives of their babies better than we. How come? They just spend more money on it. They care about their babies more than we care about ours. I think it's a disgrace. And this country has vast wealth. You just look at what something like Star Wars. The money spent on Star Wars, already spent $20 billion on it. If these guys are permitted to go ahead, they will spend $1 trillion on Star Wars. Think of what that money could be used for, to educate, to help, to bring people up to a sense of self-confidence, to improve not just the happiness of people in America, but their economic standing, to improve the competitiveness of the United States compared to other countries. We are using money for the wrong stuff.
Hey, look at the stuff now, too, with like hunger, poverty, homelessness. It's like we have the material resources to eliminate all this stuff. And the only reason it's not happening is because we choose to instead let billionaires hold on to it. It's like, why?
And control the government.
Why?
And yeah, and then, well, they do these occasional, like, just meaningless philanthropic activities. So that's better. That's better than healthcare when you think about it. But but my whole point,
charity,
and God, maybe we should have a whole separate. I mean, that's a whole separate topic of like the racket of private charity. But I'm trying not to weird people out too much with this episode of.
Yeah, just look at Rob Larson has like a 2-hour interview on that. Just everybody check that out. Rob Larson is awesome. I interviewed him on my channel as well. He's fantastic. He's one of the only people I read on like politics, makes me laugh out loud. And his writing is like some of the best I've ever read on like socialism and economics and stuff. So definitely check him out. He has a whole interview on why, Bill Gates specifically, philanthropic giving in general is kind of a racket. That's a good thing to check him out on.
And but I read The Demon Haunted World by Carl Sagan a few years ago, and it's he kind of connects his left-wing politics, or his like, you know, sort of socialist or socialist adjacent politics to his skepticism. And, you know, you just don't seem to see that anymore. And, you know, 'cause now it seems like the skeptical movement is primarily associated with like, you know, capitalism and being anti-social. Like there are like woke wings of the skeptical atheist movement. There are like, you know, anti-woke wings, but, you know, there doesn't seem to be much of like a socialist wing of, you know, like online atheism or, you know, just like skepticism generally. Do you have any clue about why that is? Because it wasn't always that way.
Yeah, I don't really know. I mean, hey, we're trying to counter that, right? I've been doing my channel so far has been like a ping pong back and forth between philosophy of religion and, you know, pro-socialism stuff, which I'm trying to branch out now because I don't care as much about philosophy of religion. But yeah, I don't know. Again, it's all like, this is all speculation. I don't really know because as we were talking about, even my friend Dustin, who's actually a Christian, but like super progressive, like, you know, basically agrees with me on like everything politically and socially. Like we're on the same page. We're both like pro-choice, pro-gun control, socialists. But
yeah, me and other people have mentioned that we thought Dustin was an atheist for like months before realizing he was a Christian.
Yeah, because like all the Christians online are just horrible morally, like on Facebook and most of them. So you have a guy who's like very sensible and is like, hey, maybe we should care about people. You're like, hey, you must be one of us. And he's like, I'm a Christian. We're like, well, you're the only one that of these people that's actually. I have a friend, Samuel Watkinson, who've had on my channel before, who's also kind of like that. He's a Christian, but he's very like, you know, progressive. He's very sensible politically. As far as like why that could be the case, I don't know. I mean, part of it I think has to do somewhat with like the mediums through which these things take place. I mean, one of the new atheist things started very much as an online movement, and I think there is kind of this. And I don't want to link. I obviously don't think like the skeptical movement is turned into like the incel movement or anything, but I don't think like that's the progression that's happened. But I think there is something to be said for like the fact that when you have these like purely kind of online kind of weird like fringe ideological echo chambers that like they're able to sort of. I remember being like that, like being, I had a pretty, this is such an embarrassing thing to admit. I told this girl I was dating this one time, and I was like, how have you not left me after hearing this? Because I said something like, I used to run like, when I was again in high school, we were libertarians. I had like an Instagram libertarian meme account that was pretty big, got pretty big. And so I was part of that whole world. And like, it is like a community. It becomes like an echo chamber because like you follow all the people that agree with you and they follow you and you're like in these group chats and stuff. So I feel like there's got to be, and that's how I feel like new atheism was. Like it was sort of an echo chamber thing online, like all getting together. But I mean, it's not specifically an atheist thing, right? Because I mean, a lot of basically any Catholic, there's exceptions. Most Catholics have like very traditionalist, like almost proto-fascist views on like social progress and stuff. But at the end of the day, I don't know because like honestly, it's surprising to me. Like I don't know how to explain it because it surprises me because I always found like there was like a connection with me to like, you know, ceasing to be super religious or at least fundamentally religious and kind of becoming more open to. I mean, I feel like I was probably still a Christian when I started to become like left-wing economically, but I mean, I was definitely not open to like socially progressive views on like sexual ethics and gender until I was, you know, secular. So it is weird, right? Because I've always felt like there was a pretty clear progression with me, at least, between like, oh, like I don't have to believe this like religious stuff anymore. Like I can now look at these views on like gender and sexuality and all these other progressive things. And so there always was a connection with me between like being secular and being progressive. So I don't really get why.
I saw this tweet from Christina Hoff Sommers. She retweeted this story about how like 8 out of 10 philosophy majors are socialists instead of capitalists or something like that. And she was like, yeah, and 2 out of 10 think for themselves. And I just thought, I was like,
funny.
Yeah, I mean, it's so funny that so many like self-identified skeptics have an issue with skepticism towards the official state ideology of their countries. It's like, look, you can make arguments against socialism, but you cannot say that accepting the official state ideology is thinking for yourself. But that somehow passes as like skepticism in most of the skeptical community. So I don't really have much of an insight to how this happened or like why things are this way. Like I don't know how we got from Carl Sagan to, you know, like where we are now. I think it has something to do with new atheists. Like Sam Harris is so anti-communist and so anti-socialist. I think that he has a lot to do with it. I don't know. I don't have much of an insight to it other than just that, like, you know, libertarians have sort of claimed the mantle of like, we're the logical ones. Like we're like the facts over feelings people.
Yeah.
And,
sure.
the only way that you could be a socialist is if you're just like this idiot, like bleeding heart.
Yeah,
just,
you're an emotional, yeah.
You're
exactly.
sad when you see homeless people, and then you just can't be reasoned with after that.
That's a great summary, man. That should be like a political dictionary summaries.
But yeah, they're the people who have transcended the need for, feelings, and, they're just all fucking data from Star Trek, and they've
they're pretty much computers. They're just like processing does not logically follow. Like, hey, sorry, capitalism. It's
capitalism is the only system that works. Yeah, that's what it turns into. But, and if that's true, like we mentioned earlier, then I don't see the need to deport, imprison, and murder people who inveigh against capitalism. But we fund and arm terrorist death squads to kill and dismember and torture people who try to unionize in other countries. But this is the only system that works. I mean,
but hey, it works, right?
We've killed literally millions of civilians abroad in the past century over this. And like, if socialism doesn't work, then why the need for the terrorism? Like, why the need for the interventionism? Like, why deport people like Emma Goldman? Like, why imprison people like Eugene Debs? And why, murder people like Fred Hampton, who's killed by the FBI? It just doesn't make any sense. And, these people have the audacity to call themselves skeptics, and it's very annoying to me.
Yeah, like, it's funny, just like this generally neoliberalism has been for sure like a majority view, like capitalism. So it's like when you take a degree like philosophy that teaches critical thinking, and the majority, I mean, imagine using that logic on something else. Like 80% of philosophers disagree with external world skepticism. And it's like, well, 20% think for themselves. Like, no, maybe just people who learn to think critically, like, kind of come to similar conclusions about certain positions because it's sort of obvious. And if you're not in the grip of like decades of propaganda, you can pretty clearly see that like one of these things is preferable.
I wrote this down as you mentioned your libertarian meme account. So,
oh God, yeah. Remind me.
Is taxation theft, Micah?
17-year-old me certainly thought so. There are multiple memes that were just that topic. Oh God, man, yeah, that was a big one. All libertarian memes usually come down to like the same 3 points in just like different formats. It's like taxation's theft, government bad, and that's about it. Or something with guns. Usually a lot of gun memes.
Well, we're pro-gun on this podcast. I don't know about you, but...
Oh, yeah, I'm kind of like, I don't care. Just sort of like generally pro-gun control because of Dustin Crummett has a paper on this that I really like, and then Hugh LaFollette does too. So I'm kind of like, yeah, I'm fine with that.
I wouldn't say I'm like anti-gun control. I'm just not like anti-gun. Like I think there should be restrictions and everything, but...
Oh, yeah, for sure. Like I own a couple. And they're fun to shoot and like stuff like that just for fun. And I'm fine with like people owning some guns. We actually want to cover like the taxation part because that's is when it gets interesting.
Yeah. How do you respond to the taxation is theft meme?
Wow. There's a lot to dig into with that one. Actually, it's actually one of the more complicated. I mean, it's not super complicated, but it is interesting. I mean, this is fun because it's getting into like actual philosophy, as opposed to just being like, well, you support Venezuela. And it's like, no.
Yeah.
as far as like this correcting semantics, I mean, so there's a couple things to do with that one. I mean, Ben Burgess has a good video on it, and he mentions it in his book. So taxation's theft, well, that alone, of course, isn't like an argument. It's just a statement. And it can, depending on how you take the words, it can be question begging. So a lot of times people say, and I've had a video on this a while back that was sort of like low production quality, but I just made really quickly because I was like, this is interesting. So if you define, like, it depends on like, so it's like, okay, starting off, let's define theft. Like, what is theft? And people say, oh, well, it's like the wrongful stealing of, like the blah, blah, blah. So if you define theft as wrong, and so you're saying, oh, well, taxation's theft, and it's wrong. And taxation's obviously wrong because you're making it equivalent to theft. That's just question begging, right? You're assuming that theft means something wrong and equating taxation to that. So obviously it's going to be wrong, but it's just question begging. So you're building wrongness into the definition of theft. Same as like if you're like, well, abortion's murder. Well, murder is built into the definition. So it's question begging to say this without defining it. So a lot of times then what you have to do to make it not question begging, if you're going to break this down into an argument, you have to say something like, well, taxation's stealing. And again, you have to define stealing a certain way. Like, oh, well, okay, well, stealing wrong? That's like, is stealing wrong by definition of what it is? Or is it, and if you're saying that the stealing, the theft, whatever is wrong by definition, then it's just a question begging statement and it's, useless, like whatever. But if we say stealing, well, no, say stealing is a morally neutral term. Like I take something from somebody else, then you can argue from there. Like, well, so the statement taxation is stealing is morally neutral, but stealing in this case is wrong. But once we break it down to that element, there's a couple things to take into account. I mean, for one thing, stealing is not always wrong. And I think if you think stealing is always wrong, that's just like a pretty ludicrous position. So say, for example, you're a starving family in like Victorian England, and your kids are starving. So you steal a loaf of bread from like your neighbors who are like aristocrats, like they're rich or whatever. And you like break into their house and you steal a loaf of bread and you bring it back to feed your children to like keep them alive. Like you've stolen from these people. But was what you did wrong? Like, would it have been, or maybe it was not even right. Maybe it was morally neutral. But like, should you just let your kids starve? Is that the right thing to do in this case? So there are plenty of cases in which we can, and that's just like one very simple thought experiment. We can think of a ton where it's like, yeah, obviously, stealing is sometimes, in some cases, like in that one, it's the right thing to do, as opposed to being not only just not wrong, it's like you should steal, like from like a prescriptive statement, like, no, in this situation, you should steal from this person. There's also, so some people want to do is they want to just grant the argument more like what it wants. Like, yeah, sure, taxation's wrong, but we can balance it against the goods that we get from it, like socially, and say just like, well, yeah, sure, like taxation, stealing, it's theft, whatever, it's wrong, but people get healthcare as a result of it, so like it's fine. Like we should do it still because the benefits outweigh the costs, and that's a perfectly reasonable like position to take, right? Like there's nothing wrong with like balancing things against each other and saying, like, yeah, this thing may be wrong, but it's still the preferable option. Like it's still the right thing to do because of what it will produce.
Right.
So
like most human actions are not. It's not a black and white choice between right and wrong. It's a choice between competing goods.
Yeah, exactly. So it's like, sure, maybe like. Maybe respecting Jeff Bezos' right to own all his money is a good thing, but is that more right than, giving children like proper school lunches or just schools in the first place? So that's a perfectly, so Ben Burgess talked about, like, that's a perfectly fine way to go about arguing against this. Just say that like the moral balance of it comes out to where it's still a better thing to do. But I think also once you break down the logic of it, it becomes very clear that like, yeah, stealing is definitely not always wrong. And this is, I don't know if we have time to get really into this. I mean, this is, and then the more complicated way to argue for this is to go for like, and so Ben Burgess, the philosopher, has a lecture on this online. I think it's from the Zero Books channel called like, Is Taxation Theft? It's like Rawls, like John Rawls and Redistributive Justice. So there are social contract arguments to the effect that taxation is just like your contribution to like a social system that you're a part of, then you benefit from, right? Because there's this kind of like way of viewing wealth that libertarians have where they view it as like a created and owned in a vacuum. But that's not at all, of course, how wealth works. Like if you're making money in a system where there's a government, then the government itself has set up, in some senses, like the markets and the social structures and the economic systems in place by which you can even attain any kind of wealth. So you're not like creating these things in a vacuum. You're creating it in a system that's been created to maximize like your ability to create wealth, right? So you do kind of, in a sense, you owe some of what you've produced back to the system that made it possible for you to produce anything in the first place. So there is a sense in which you do have social obligations to the systems that you're taking part of and like, you're benefiting from. So that's kind of like a very primitive way to state a basic kind of like idea of social contractarianism, but not that's not really a social contract. That's just saying like, hey, you benefit from things that the government has put in place, or even if it's anarchism, like, the system is put in place. So you kind of should contribute back to the system because you're benefited from it. So you can keep the lion's share of your profits and you'll be comfortable, but you should also, be kind of part of this social unit. So people don't exist in vacuums, and we're talking about political philosophy. We don't create wealth in vacuums. We don't have power in vacuums. We're not subject to power in vacuums. We don't create things or do actions in vacuums. Everything we're doing is part of a social collective, and that doesn't commit you to being collectivist. It's just recognizing what the social systems are that are in place. And there are also there's more complex contractarian arguments, like egalitarian, like maybe Rawlsian or even Andersonian or Coneian, or like some like Cohen's, where you get to a point where it's like when you're committed to an egalitarianism because of kind of a social system you're in, then you're sort of morally obligated to help provide for other people. I think that's a valid way to go to, or a kind of a good way to go to. Sometimes just saying like, well, no, if you owe kind of in some sense like Scanlon, like, well, we owe each other, like we owe each other certain things. And some libertarians want to deny this and say we just have negative rights and not positive rights. And I think that's a self-defeating position. I think negative rights just entail positive ones. But I think positive rights are also pretty easy to argue for. I won't go into that here. And I won't go into like the complexities of social contract arguments right here. I mean, that's a whole topic. I've been planning on doing a whole video on this. And I actually talk about taxation a lot in my video response to Trent Horn when he talks about one of his problems with socialism. I think the general thing to get down is when you break this argument down, you have to understand that it's coming from for one thing, it also presupposes a controversial idea of what ownership is. It presupposes a kind of like a Lockean understanding of how we come to own things, of like just like mixing our labor with like natural things. And the Lockean view of property owner entitlement is just bonkers. It's just weird and crazy for a lot of reasons. I mean, and we can talk about that if we need to, but I mean, in general, like it's fine. I mean, Current Affairs has an article on this too. But Ben Burgess in his book covers it, and he has a video on it as well. But I mean, the key things to look at is like once you break down the argument, if it's just saying that like taxation is stealing, you can grant that and be like, fine, stealing is sometimes the right thing to do, and it's definitely not always wrong. Or you can go the route of we need to balance the harms against the goods. We can say, sure, we're violating people's right to own all their money. But then, of course, the idea that people are entitled to all their money presupposes, for one thing, this kind of vacuum idea of how wealth's created, which is pretty clearly false, but also this sort of like Lockean or kind of neo-Lockean or neoliberal understanding of how property entitlement works. And Thomas Nagel actually has a co-authored book called like The Myth of Ownership, where he talks about this extensively. So there's a lot of, I mean, this is one thing that libertarians want to break it down to being as simple as like a meme you can post online. But of course, there's an extensive philosophical literature about what even constitutes proper ownership. So yeah, but I think breaking down the logic of the statements and what the terms mean is crucial to understanding this. Because at the end of the day, all they're saying is like, well, taxation is the government stealing from people, and that's wrong. And it's like, no, it's not. Because sometimes stealing from people who are privileged to give to people who are underprivileged is what we should do. So there's a lot more. I've already said a lot about it, and there's a lot more to say about the taxation stuff. I do want to do like an entire video on this because it's such a common talking point for right-wingers. But hopefully that's a decent like overview of how to think about that as a socialist.
Wow.
At least
that's an excellent answer. I honestly did not expect that comprehensive of an answer. But no, I think the key point for that, I mean, historically for me, I've always just gone the utilitarian route, like you said, or like you implied, that like, well, look, stealing is not always wrong. Like there's, yeah. But I think the more interesting route in a way is to just ask, well, what is property? Because, taxation is theft. Mm-hmm. Well, theft of what? Property. Well, what is that? And there are
property is theft. Actually, there's a classic leftist argument to that effect.
Well, and you could you could so easily turn the tables on this and like just say something else is theft, and then it would spawn like an equally complex litany of reactions and counter reactions. Like I think Richard Wolff says something about this where he's like, I could just as easily say like, well, look, it only costs like $12,000 to produce this car, but I get charged $25,000 for it. This is theft. And he's just like, I mean, and he kind of just dismissed it. And he's like, you're just saying you just don't like paying taxes, like you don't.
Which is like, yeah, nobody likes paying taxes. Like you got to do it. Like,
and something I brought up when my Ayn Randian pal said this to me at one point, I just said, they're technically not taxation is theft people. Like they do believe in a government for like defense and like a couple basic.
Minarchist, probably, yeah.
Yeah, but they want there to be like a separation of economics and state in a way, and then things will be awesome after that. But
no way that could go wrong.
I mentioned how when you're working a job, the dynamic is, whatever you're getting paid, you're generating more wealth than what you're getting paid. Couldn't you call that theft? Like you're creating this wealth and then you're not getting,
like, the wage slavery and like, kind of wage theft. That's a kind of classic Marxist idea that's you can argue for just as easily, if not more so, than the libertarian argument.
Yeah, it almost seems more defensible in a way. And it's like, I don't walk around saying that like, taking the surplus value is theft. I'm just saying it could be distributed differently in a way that would lead to better outcomes,
Yeah. I also should point out, there's a kind of a philosophical or kind of pseudo-philosophical principle. So also to plug, I keep plugging my own stuff. I mean, just because it's not even my stuff. I'm just saying like, because I want to point to people who do this stuff better than me. So Dustin, in my interview with him, we talked, like our last 30 minutes or so was focused solely on libertarian argument. So I have a separate video I made, a cut of just like the 30-minute segment we did on responding to libertarian arguments. And so I definitely recommend that, because like what I'm going to say here is kind of largely repeating in summary what he said, but the taxation is theft stuff also usually it kind of presupposes this principle that libertarians like to use called the non-aggression principle, which at first sounds like this very like straightforward, commonsensical, like pacifist, like, oh yeah, you shouldn't just like attack people for no reason. It's like, yeah, okay, that makes sense. But then once you like actually dig into like the ideology behind what they're saying, they also think like, oh, you can't like aggress on my property in any way. And if you do, I have the right to like respond with like whatever force I want. And so the thing Dustin said about this is it's just sort of like the non-aggression principle is not something any philosophers really take seriously. I mean, even Nozick, like the kind of the like ultimate example of a libertarian philosopher, like the best like defense of libertarianism ever was Nozick. Even he's serious enough to understand like the non-aggression principle doesn't work. I think Mike Humer might defend a version of it, but not exactly surprising. But Nozick doesn't. So a lot of no political philosopher really takes this seriously, but you'll find it a lot online, so it's worth like talking about, I guess. And at first, again, it sounds like, oh, it's the way, like, I think it was Murray Rothbard who originally laid it out. It sounds very commonsensical. It's like, yeah, you shouldn't aggress on people unless they aggress on you. It's like, yeah, you shouldn't just like go around shooting people. Like, that sounds sensible. Once you add to that, like, because that's just like a classic, like, everybody agrees, like, you shouldn't just like attack people for no reason. But once you build into them the understanding of property, it's like, oh, well, you can't aggress on my property. And what they mean by aggress and what they think is like violence is kind of becomes very broad and very weird. And the thing Dustin said about this I thought was really funny is he was like, yeah, like the non-aggression principle as understood by libertarians, you can't even justify a society past the age of fire because you might aggress on somebody's property by like, smoke inhalation, or he's like, if I fire a gun like near you, well, I've aggressed on you because it's like so. He's like, yeah, no, he's like the non-aggression principle can't justify any society built past like the discovery of fire. And also there's this thought experiment about this of like, well, if you own a cabin in the woods and I'm like bleeding out, or like there's a blizzard and I'm gonna not bleeding out. If there's a blizzard and like I'm gonna freeze to death. Like I break a window in your cabin that nobody's in and like get inside to keep myself alive. Like, have I done something morally wrong? Have I violated some principle? Do you have the right now to shoot me? 'Cause, again, libertarians tend to think that like once you're aggressed upon, you can respond with violence. But they take violence to include things of like property, which is kind of ridiculous when you think about it. I mean, like if I break a bottle, is that violent? Or if I like smash a window, like we have these things in Florida called rage rooms where you can pay to just go in and like smash stuff. And like they set it up to look like real rooms. It's like, is that violence? Like, am I breaking a bottle? Or I'm like, is that...
That's like one of the most Florida things I've ever heard. I've never heard of those before. That's crazy.
Yeah, no, I need to probably go do one time. It'd be very therapeutic for me, I'm sure. But in general, it's like there's no such like violence against inanimate objects, and like property is sort of like a weird concept. But the idea that you could respond to that with violence similarly is also like really strange. So again, this all bleeds into, they say like, well, taxation is like some form of aggression because like the money I create is my property. And so like if you try to take it from me through taxation, then that's like violence against me. And I can like, no, it's not. That's not violence is. Like violence, like, treating violence as like kind of this all be all end all term for just like any sort of disruption of molecules or of funds is sort of ridiculous. But also like the classic non-aggression principle as it's normally stated is just ludicrous. Like again, Dustin said, like if I'm bleeding out, can I like force you? Like if somebody's bleeding out and like there's like a rich guy in a limo and it's like, hey, and it's the only car around, like, hey, this guy needs to get to the hospital, he's going to die. And the guy's like, oh, no, I don't want him to bleed on my seat. Like if you force the rich guy to let this dude in his car to get him to the hospital, like if you've done something wrong, like you're saving somebody's life and you're aggressing on this dude's property because he's bleeding on his seats and like you're non-consensually taking over his car, but like, is that wrong? No, of course not. And like breaking into a cabin to save your own life, is that wrong? No, of course not. Is breaking somebody's bottle wrong? No, of course not. So a lot of times, I should have pointed this out before, the taxation and theft argument usually presupposes this non-aggression principle. And the non-aggression principle, again, if you take it just to mean you shouldn't be violent without cause, like you shouldn't hurt people, that's fine. But libertarians usually have this kind of weird conception of property and violence they build into it, which they then move into the taxation and theft arguments. And the whole like premise of the non-aggression principle is just absurd. And it's so absurd, again, no philosopher really takes it seriously, even libertarian philosophers. So that's also important to work out. But I like the line you said too of just like being like, hey, there's obviously like we can weigh the goods of like, yeah, maybe taking Jeff Bezos' money is wrong, but is, we gotta give kids healthcare so they don't die of preventable diseases. Like, so there's a lot of ways to go with that. But the NAP is stupid is the general tagline for this section.
my favorite, what's his name? Trent Horn bit, like when he was defending this sort of argument, is he was just like, taxation is theft and theft is a sin. And I loved that extra little justification of, and theft is a sin.
It was so bad. I think that was the clip I responded to. Where I just like, I literally paused the video and just groaned. I was like, no.
I'll be defending the claim no good Catholic can be a true socialist. There are priests and theologians who defend socialism, just as there are priests and theologians who defend sodomy and abortion. The question is, can a good Catholic be a true socialist? And a good Catholic obeys the teachings of the Church. So what does the Church teach on this subject? The wording of tonight's resolution comes from Pope Pius XI's encyclical Quadragesimo Anno, where he said, religious socialism, Christian socialism are contradictory terms. No one can be at the same time a good Catholic and a true socialist. In 1963, Pope John XXIII likewise said, no Catholic could subscribe even to moderate socialism.
It's just so alien to me. I mean, for obviously because I'm an atheist, but also because I grew up Protestant. So it's like when people he'll say things like, well, Pope fuckface the fourth, in 1101, and I'm just like, why are you even appealing to that? Who gives a fuck? Like I can't even relate to that, and I was a Christian for most of my life, and just my Protestant sensibilities are just like, what the fuck? Who cares what the Pope said? Or like this is the official teaching of the Church. And it's like, and like, I don't get how that adds to something.
Yeah, no, it is. I mean, it would be, I just hate that, man. Like having to live your life like, oh, wow, political position. Well, I got to check with the 2,000-year-old tradition. Like, can I believe this? Oh, well, looks like I can. Sucks for me. Yeah. Like, that would just be horrible.
Yeah, like I listened to one of his podcasts recently about the philosophy of time. It like came recommended from someone on Twitter. I can't remember who, but they were like, oh, this is a good introduction to philosophy of time. And I was like, oh, cool. So I listened to it, and it was pretty good. But he said at the beginning, he was like, the Church doesn't have an official teaching on which philosophy of time you have to adhere to. So it's up to you. And I was just like,
oh, thank you.
I can't even imagine living my life like that. Like, just like
having to have that caveat, like, by the way, like socialism is not condemned by the secular humanist organization, so we can talk about it. Like, can you imagine that? Like, oh my gosh. But his book on socialism, he literally did the thing where he like at one point compared the like socialism like the Nazis. And I was like, dude, and so I remember I added him on Twitter one time because he was like, yeah, I read these like atheist books. I was like, good, now do the same thing with socialism. He was like, oh, I read this book by like Bhaskar Sunkara, and I wasn't that impressed. And I was like, there is no way in hell you read Bhaskar Sunkara before you wrote that book. Because I was like, if you did, you would not have made like the most fundamental errors ever. Like he said, he also said he read like part of Richard Wolff's book, and I was like, there's no way you read Richard Wolff and Bhaskar Sunkara and then wrote that book you did on socialism, because it was so bad that like it's not even like you weren't even arguing against socialism. Like the entire book, as far as I could tell. And even if you were, and like, again, the podcast I listened to where he talked about it, he was making like the worst arguments. Like, dude, there's either you didn't read Sunkara and you're lying to me, or you just did, and like your reading comprehension is like horrible.
Yeah, I hope he just wrote that before he read those books. That would be.
Yeah, I hope he wrote it and then he read the book. That's what I'm hoping. And like the way he wrote the tweet, like that could be the case. I'm like, yeah, he read the book and then he wrote the book and then was like, maybe I should read up on this actually after he wrote the book. And so he said it's gonna be like a second edition. And I was like, yeah, good. Make it just, you know what? Just write a new one.
All right. So I'm writing a second edition with a foreword that is 200 pages long.
Everything in the following pages is false. I had it all wrong. I'm so sorry. Yeah, that'd be the only second edition I'd accept.
We didn't cover that one about like, yeah, the National Socialists. Hello. Like Nazis are, a form of socialism.
God, it's in the name.
We won't even talk about that one. That one.
It's very simple. It's like North Korea calls themselves the People's Republic of North Korea. Are they a republic? No. Okay, good. We can agree that governments sometimes lie about what they actually are structurally. So good. Let's move on. It's a very simple one.
You know what? It is simpler than I initially thought. You're right. You can just call yourself whatever you want. There's nothing in the rule book that says you can't.
Yeah, it's like, yeah, we can call ourselves anything. It's like, just ignoring the fact that the Nazis like systematically like executed socialists. It's like actual socialists.
Kind of curious about how the Soviet Union, went to such lengths to kill all the Nazis, if they were on the same team.
Yeah, right. You'd expect like, oh, wow, these guys are both socialists. I think they would have teamed up and just fought the U.S. and Britain, but not exactly.
Yeah, I mean, fascists brutally suppressed socialists, like in Italy and in Germany, obviously. But yeah, I mean, like,
oh yeah,
they kill communists. Do. Yeah, absolutely. Like part of an essential part of fascism is suppressing the economic left. Like that. That is
for sure.
Historically an essential part of fascism.
Yeah, Jason Stanley talks about that in his book How Fascism Works, which I highly recommend. It's a great book. But he talked, like, that's one of his last chapters, is how like fascists are always like trying to preserve like capitalist institutions, and like they're going to rail against anything, even like that even challenges like something like Bernie Sanders. That's not even a. Well, that's the thing, is like even like the Trump even calls Biden a communist, and it's like I wish he was, but
Yeah.
yeah. So it's essential part of fascism is being like just adamantly anti-socialist.
I mean, like that, I do have so much to say about that, because there are people like on the socialist left who love to throw out like Nazbol as an insult of basically anyone who is like, I don't know, even like mildly critical of like identity politics or wokeness. They're like, yeah, you're basically like a nationalist and a socialist, so you're a Nazi. And it's
man, leftists are so horrible like with each other.
I know,
that's why it's good to like get in at the philosophical level, like with like people like Chomsky and Ben Burgess, like pretty rational. Then, because if you dive right into like the Twitter communists who are like really like weird and like anti-voting and like they're just like they're all kinds of strange. Like anybody who's not a communist to them, like you got to start with people who are like left unity and like democratic socialists, and that's So I mean, but they of course tankies and like Marxists are like, you guys are all posers. And it's like, all right, man, whatever. Most political philosophers are more moderate. Like it's mostly the people you find on like again Twitter online that are like the weird like radicals. Like most of your people who are leftists that are actually like engaged in political philosophy, they're broadly egalitarians, so they're usually like democratic socialists or libertarian socialists or even social democrats. I mean, the people that know what they're talking about, like G.A. Cohen, Elizabeth Anderson, like Rawls, even the people that were kind of like traditionally socialists, like they're not like these crazy like Marxist Leninists or Maoists or anything insane like that. Like they're just like egalitarians. So yeah, you got to start with that. If you dive right into like leftist Twitter, you're gonna be like, yeah, I'm a reactionary now. Yeah, and it's hard to blame you.
If your first introduction to these things is like Antifa, then yeah, I don't blame you. But like, I speaking of leftist infighting, I wanted to bring up one issue before we go. You mentioned a couple times open borders. And you sound a little bit sympathetic to that. Bernie Sanders famously said in 2016, he was like, open borders, that's a Koch brothers proposal. And a lot of people got mad at that.
But I think if you take global poverty that seriously, it leads you to conclusions that in the US are considered out of political bounds. Things like sharply raising the level of immigration we permit, even up to a level of open borders, about sharply increasing
open
the
borders.
Foreign aid.
That's a Koch brothers proposal. The
really?
idea, of course, I mean that's a right-wing proposal, which says essentially there is no United States.
But it would make a lot of global poor richer, wouldn't it?
And it'd make everybody in America poor. Then you're doing away with the concept of a nation state, and I don't think there's any country in the world which believes in that. You have an obligation, in my view, to do everything we can to help poor people. What right-wing people in this country would love is an open border policy. Bring in all kinds of people who work for $2 or $3 an hour. That would be great for them. I don't believe in that. I think we have to raise wages in this country. I think we have to do everything that we can to create the millions of jobs. You know what youth unemployment in the United States of America today? If you're white, a white kid, high school graduate, 33%. A Hispanic, 36%, African-American, 51%. You think we should open the borders and bring in a lot of low-wage workers? Or do you think maybe we should try to get jobs for those kids?
As kind of open borders becomes more popular on like, at least the activist left, or at least as far as I can tell on people's yard signs, when they say things like, those, I don't know if they have those everywhere, but like those black yard signs with like rainbow letters that say like, love is love, no human is legal, all that stuff.
Yeah, I've seen those around. I've not seen like the yard signs as much, but I've definitely seen the logo around places like online and stuff like that. Yeah,
it seems like that was not a popular position until recent. Like it was exclusively held by like libertarians who just want to exploit like poor immigrants, and then all of a sudden it's like the woke belief. How do you fund some of these like programs if you just have open borders, like just as a technical matter? Like I know some people like Rucker Bregman, who's kind of a social democrat, leaning democratic socialist, like. He's for open borders and he's for UBI, and he has like a pretty simple scheme for how to square those two things, because there's a pretty obvious tension between UBI and open borders.
Right.
But same goes for any like big spending social program. So I've always kind of been anti open borders because I thought that it would just make things too complicated for like Medicare for all. or for, even just UBI or something, which kind of seems like the only thing we can hope for, honestly, at least in the short term. I mean, things can change quickly, but it seems like UBI might be a realistic goal going forward, but I don't see how you can...
At least in the conversation.
So are you pro open borders or no? And how do you square that with some of these social programs?
Yeah, well, it's one of those things where like I'd say I am, but it's not one that I've sort of like looked into like a lot of literature on, like a ton. I think there's a couple things to do though in terms of like making it, but I do lean that way and have for a while, being like, yeah. And actually, funny enough, I think when I was a libertarian, I was closed borders. Because I was like, it was just funny. I think I fluctuated on it honestly when I was a libertarian. But as far as now, I lean towards thinking it is. As far as like paying for it, and I think there are a couple things to do. So I think kind of helping reduce the systemic problems that create refugee crises. And so there's a couple of ways to do this. I mean, we're not the only country that deals with immigration like this, and it's going to get a lot worse. Like for example. The European countries, a lot of them are having refugee influxes of refugees, and that's only going to get worse in the next 20 to 100 years because next 100 years or less, there's going to be areas in the Middle East that are going to be inhabitable because of climate change. Like 20 degrees hotter, people will not be able to live there. It'll be impossible. So if I think the refugee crisis is bad now, it's going to get a lot worse due to
mass migration is in our future for sure.
Right. So. I kind of this is not a very good argument, but there's this kind of like leftist tendency I have, or maybe it's more of a primitive one, to just be like, borders are fake, countries are fake, it's just land, we all move around, like this is dumb. So there's a part of me that's like that, like, nations, borders, it's all kind of like a nominalist farce. So there's part of me that has that intuition, but as far as a more serious engagement with it, I think for one thing, helping to reduce, so for other countries, reducing the causes of immigration would be like having better environmental factors, or, stopping wars. And then for us, it'd be like, less intervention in places like Mexico and like Venezuela, Cuba, like not destroying them, not having trade embargoes and things like that, and not invading, kind of repairing the damage we've done in some of these countries in like Latin America, and then helping change like systemic problems that we've caused, or even ones that we haven't caused, is kind of helping, kind of treating it at the source rather than the effects, like kind of helping, like reducing the cause. As far as like the at service level, I mean, there are a couple things to say about this. And again, it's not something I've like delved into super deeply, so my answer is probably not going to be like the best, honestly. But I'll say what I thought about it initially, which is that for one thing, we have to balance, and I've seen some analysis on this, but I'm not positive. We have to analyze the cost of what it would be to help immigrants in terms of giving them like housing, jobs, whatever, like the basic necessities. And also, because we do have to pay, one thing we have to pay for now is the upkeep of like detention centers at the borders. So we have to pay salaries to ICE officers, we have to pay to keep children in cages and like feed people, and like, which again, we don't feed or give them enough medical attention as is, but there is quite a steep cost to the upkeep of stopping immigration, right? So we spend a lot of money. And I forget the exact figures on this. A couple years ago, there was a journalist who did a video on how it actually would be cheaper to let immigrants in than it is to keep them out. And I'm not confident, I'm not positive on that, so don't quote me on being committed to that position. But it is undeniably true that it does cost money, and a good deal of money, to secure the entire borders, and like in terms of the government agencies we pay to do that. And then like the actual, again, like if we're spending billions of dollars to build a wall, as Trump supporters want, that costs a lot of money. So as a purely monetary thing, we would have money to spend on helping immigrants if we're not spending that money on keeping them out. So there's one sense in which that works, but there's also the classic answer that there is to any time people ask things about whether it's healthcare or anything, where there's like, how are we going to pay for it? Well, we are able to pay hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars a year on, or hundreds of billions of dollars a year on war, like the same way we pay for
literally
anything.
The increase in the military budget this year was more than the cost of tuition-free college. The increase, not the military budget, the increase in the military budget, which, by the way, a lot of Democrats voted for. That we could have tuition-free college, like just with the increase in the military budget last year.
You're right, and it's just insane to point that out. Like, not even like all the money we spent in the military. No, the money we added to spending in the military, and we're not even actively engaged in defense. All we're actively engaged in is maintaining bases and imperialism all across the globe. So
yeah, drone bombing everything in sight.
Yeah, drone exactly. Exactly. Basically, perpetuating global terrorism. It's expensive. and it's also wrong. And so I feel like
military-industrial complex, baby. We gotta, keep those people rich.
Exactly. It's a war is a racket. That's for sure true. So I mean, there's that thing too, where it's like the same way we pay for anything is we use money for, again, we tax billionaires more, and we stop spending so much money to blow people up all across the planet. And like maybe we have less military bases and maybe less jets sitting around on runways. So I just hate, like, I think, because we talked about this a lot, I think the concept of choice is big here. Like the fact that we have money to increase the military budget, but not money to, say, eliminate student debt or homelessness or poverty, or allow immigrants in and children from countries who are like really poor, partially because of what we've done to them. So, I mean, we have the money for war, but not the money for things that are good, like helping people in need and eliminating debt. It's all because we're choosing to allocate resources a certain way. So I view immigration the same way. It would only cost money, quote unquote, because we're choosing to allocate resources to something else. And we don't need to allocate resources to a lot of these other things. They're useless. And in a lot of cases, not only are they useless, they're wrong. Again, it all comes down to what we were talking about earlier, which is we choose to allocate resources a certain way. And if we made different choices to do the right thing, we could do that. And we're only not doing it because we choose not to. So that's how I tend to view the open borders thing. I'm just like, look, we are spending all this money to keep them out. Why don't we try something else?
I think my heart is, kind of with your flippant response of like, borders are made up and like countries aren't real. Like
that's where my heart is, it's like, it's all fake,
Yeah, no, I feel that too. I remember when I first became like politically engaged, like 5 or 6 years ago, like one of my friends who was kind of, she was like, sympathetic to like my Bernie support, and she had been like, paying attention to politics for like more than a decade and was a little bit skeptical of some things. And like, I was really like her only exposure as like a Bernie supporter, and I like knew absolutely nothing. Like all I knew is that I was like working and I was getting ripped off, and Bernie was like the only one who was saying anything about that, because he's just like, look, we can do healthcare if we want to, we can raise wages if we want to. But I knew nothing. Like I was just, this was right after like my like, like I said, juvenile like libertarian days, and I was like just transitioning out of that. And she asked me like, well, how do you feel about immigration? And I was like, I don't give a fuck, let them all in. And then she was just like, okay, well, you can't do that and have Medicare for all. And I was like, and like, in that moment, like, of course I had never thought of that. And I was like, well, my apologies to those immigrants, but
my apologies, my condolences.
but no, I mean, I think that what you're saying makes sense in the sense that if you want to like try to allocate resources in this specific way, it is possible maybe to have open borders and like a UBI and Medicare for all or something like that. But the thing is to actually carry out, the sort of reallocation that, the mass reallocation in our government that would be necessary to have both of those things, it's just completely impossible. Like you would have to have like a complete takeover of every branch of government where every single branch is on the same page about what we're doing. And
right.
That's just not going to happen. So I feel like
that's the struggle as a socialist, is everything you want done is not really feasible in the short term, right? So I mean, like, we're not going to be able to go from where we're at now to democratic socialism. Like, that's just not going to happen. We have to probably move towards something like a social democracy. Then, like Brunig's proposal, have the government buy up stocks and capital gradually. So I mean, it is the struggle of being so far left wing, where you have to be like, everything that, like, the way I want the world to look is a pretty far off reality. We can like do things to get there. And I mean, for starters, things like, and so the same with immigration, right? Yeah, you're right. That like it would, in terms of in the short term, actually organizing a governmental structure to be able to carry this out is sort of definitely not going to happen like in the next year or so. But my condolences to those immigrants. That was funny.
Yeah. Well, because I mean, it's obvious that like in the short term, you're going to have to pick one or the other. You can't have like open borders would be an obstacle to any sort of expansion of like a social democratic program. Like, hypothetically, you could maybe do both, maybe, but you would, like I said, it would just have to be such an overhaul of the way that we do things. It's like you just have to pick the order that you want things to happen in, and just I just don't see. I'm not gonna put front and center one of my main priorities a Koch brothers proposal that is clearly just going to be used to exploit poor people and drive down wages for people working here, and really just like prevent us from expanding these sort of programs that we're talking about.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, because you're right in the sense, and like we don't want the libertarian idea of like, yeah, open borders so they can come in and be underpaid. And it's like no. So obviously, moving towards a more kind of socialist style, even social ethos is going to be something that's going to have to precede anything like that. So that's probably true.
Yeah, Rutger Bregman had kind of a funny idea about it, where he's like, okay, so stay with me, but second-class citizens. He's like, so we have open borders. He's like, and when you come in, you're a second-class citizen legally for like 5 years, and like you don't get sort of access to certain things. Like you are not equal to like a first-class citizen. And it's like, well, that sounds pretty bad. And he's just like, no, that's what we have now. It's just, it's not formalized into the system. He's like, we already have second-class citizenship. It's just, he's like, what I'm suggesting would actually be an improvement upon the lives of like many immigrants. And he's like, especially illegal immigrants, because there would be no such thing anymore. So as horrible and technocratic as it sounds at first, I just don't see, like I said, I'm not in favor of open borders, but if you were in favor of open borders, that's the only realistic proposal I've seen where it's like, where it is something that you could feasibly do without having to take over literally every branch of government in some kind of like Soviet style takeover. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. I'd have to think about that one more, but it sounds, I definitely think we're gonna prioritize some things over others, and a lot of times you have to change like a system before you bring people into a system. Because if we just, it's not going to help anybody if we just kind of move people into the horrible capitalist system we have now. Really, just end up working for Amazon and collapsing for 15-hour workdays. So we want to change things and make them to get things to a place where we can be more inclusive and then move towards a world where ideally, I do have anarchist tendencies where I'm just like, at the end of the day, my real utopic vision is like, we don't even have countries anymore. So like, obviously people just move around as they please. Countries are fake. I do have anarchist leanings still, even though I'm probably like a libertarian or democratic socialist, which libertarian socialism is technically sometimes can be used synonymously with like anarcho-syndicalism. So it's not entirely inconsistent. But so there's the utopic vision part of me that's just like, yeah, we should have no countries and none of that. But for the here and now, in terms of like what we can actually get done and how we're going to have policy progression, there are realistic steps and orders in which we have to take certain steps. So, right. Yeah.
Well, wow, we have been going for a while now.
Yeah. So, seriously.
So, thank you so much for giving me your time and for spreading communist propaganda with me today.
Yes, exactly. Anytime.
Do you want to just plug your YouTube and Twitter and stuff?
Oh yeah, sure. I'm so on YouTube. I am Crusade Against Ignorance. That's me, and I've got an Instagram by the same name. If you want to check me out there, also a Facebook page, and then I don't have a Twitter for that. I have a personal Twitter. You can just look me up on Twitter, Micah Edvenson. Also on Facebook, you can check me out there. So yeah, lots of stuff on philosophy of religion, a couple things on politics so far. My interview with Dustin Crummett, which is sort of similar style to this, but with me in Emerson's role and Dustin in mine. So yeah, that's my stuff. Twitter, Mike Edvenson. The big ones, YouTube, Crusade Against Ignorance. Hopefully everybody enjoys that content. Hopefully they've enjoyed this. So thank you again for having me. It's been a blast. Anytime I can spread communist propaganda, it's a good day for me. Good use of my time.
I'll put all those links in the show notes and plenty of links to your videos and also some of your videos which aren't about socialism, because those are very good too.
Yeah, hell yeah.
Well, thank you so much. I'll talk to you later, man.
All right, man. Good to talk to you.
Its inability to confront what Marx calls exploitation, this business where you produce a surplus for somebody else rather than for yourself. Try to imagine, the Marxist image here. It's Christmas. It's a party, a Christmas party for all the workers. He thanks everybody. All the people have gathered for their Christmas party. He says, I want to thank you all. You worked so hard. You made this a very successful year where our profits were whatever. In that moment, this drunken employer recognizes that everybody contributed to the profits of that company. He doesn't ask himself the question, if they all helped to produce it, why are they all excluded from deciding what happens to what they helped to produce? How is it that I and 3 other people will make the decision what to do with the profits that they helped to produce? How come they're not mad at me? And the answer is, they are. It's your point. Yeah. They feel ripped off from something. And they may not be able to say it to him. They may not even be able to say it to themselves. But it doesn't go away. That sits there and it festers and it messes up much of the rest of the society's life and interrelationships.